Unless you think they'll be along shortly. Our first agenda item is a review and approval of the meeting agenda. Do I have a motion on that?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? That passes. Our next item is a review and approval of the minutes for our March 27th meeting, and I believe before we do that, we have two corrections.
Yes, after the last meeting, Pat Buffalino, lab director from Nassau County, called and said he just wanted to correct the record on something he said. It's on page 6 of your minutes regarding competency test. He received a competency test from Suffolk County PD and DCJS, and he had indicated in the meeting that he received them from Westchester DPS. So he wanted to make that correction to the record. And also, in addition, on page 7 of the minutes, he mentioned that the Westchester lab was performing verifications for Nassau County, but the correct answer is that they're performing the entire HV process on the lists and images from latent print cases. So I just want to make those two corrections to the meeting minutes.
Where is that correction?
Page 7.
Second paragraph? Here?
Yes, second paragraph.
With those two corrections, do I have a motion to approve the minutes of the meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? That passes. Next on our agenda are laboratory updates and accreditation items. The first item relates to the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner, Division of Forensic Services. Kathy?
Yeah, you have in your packets two issues from the Nassau County Division of Forensic Sciences, and that is the first one, which will require a vote, is their expansion of scope to include latent prints, and as well as at the same time they were going through a surveillance inspection, or on approximately the same time. They had a surveillance inspection on their Asplat Lab International biology discipline. So those two issues, you have information on both of those issues, but the only one that does require a vote is the latent print. They have a final accreditation letter from Asplat Lab stating that they have completed all their corrective actions and are accredited in that discipline. So we have to give them New York State accreditation as well.
Any discussion before we vote?
This is on the scope.
Yes.
I had some questions for Dr. Buffalo.
And Dr. Buffalino is here to answer those.
Morning, Doctor. How are you?
Good.
Doctor, let me just turn for a moment to the document that's labeled Extension of Scope Final Report, Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner, Division of Forensic Services. You have that?
I do.
Okay. This document contains a number of corrective action requests, correct?
Correct.
And these resulted from findings that were made by Asplat Lab's inspection team, and then you made the corrections.
That's correct.
Just so the record is clear, when did you begin the process of reconstituting, for want of a better term, the latent fingerprint unit?
I'm not reconstituting.
When did you start the process?
It was immediately after the commission
It's
meeting.
about a year ago?
Oh, it was about, it was close to a year, yes.
Okay. Here's my question. In the year, it seems to me that with the new team in place doing these things, that a lot of these correction action requests involve findings that seem very basic. That if I were to start up a latent fingerprint unit after the disaster that we've had in Nassau County, one would almost assume that based upon your knowledge of Asplat Lab accreditation requirements and how fingerprints work and your assistants helping you out, that a lot of these things probably shouldn't have occurred. So here's what I'm after. I mean, why would it have been a finding a year later that level 1, 2, and 3 detail used to make identifications was not identified or indicated sufficiently to allow another reviewer to evaluate what was done. This is not something new that the commission has seen. I've been here since September 10th, 2010, and I think almost at every meeting, we get a lab in here that does not properly or cannot substantiate enough information on the fingerprint documents to permit replication. And before you answer that, I want you to take into account the previous meetings where you were here with, I forget the young woman's name, who's Jennifer Hannaford's statement to us that with respect to documenting information, particularly as to the processes of the lab examiner who was doing the fingerprint comparison, that she was pulling back on the information that was going to be required. So to me, what I'm trying to figure out is why this has happened, that we had all of these kinds of problems. I understood in the beginning when you said, you know, we're in the process of redoing everything. That was fair because it's hard to do that from scratch. But here we are a year later, and a lot of these things are just seem to me very basic. No documentation for casework of the quality management director on competency testing. That's pretty basic. Why is this happening? Why did all of this occur?
Well, and it's my opinion, but we began hiring in June of last year.
Mm-hmm.
The only way for a laboratory to basically work out its kinks is through, my feeling is that we used to have a provisional accreditation process.
Right.
We'd have a set of protocols that were accepted by the commission, and then we were able to work out casework going through corrective action process if issues came up. Even though we started in June, we weren't provisionally accredited until December.
Right.
So we really had from December till January in order to work out kinks, and we went through the mock case route, which, in my opinion, it's not a route that I'd like to take. Once we had the opportunity to actually utilize our protocols with casework, we were able to work out those bugs within a 4-week period. So, you know, I don't want to minimize any of the issues, but I think the fact that we were able to utilize our protocols for true cases, it enabled us to really come together as a laboratory. There are people from different organizations coming together who have never worked together. It just reminded me of starting up in DNA in 2001.
Mm-hmm.
But at this point now, I assure you that this program is solid.
Okay. Let me just turn to, in the document that I referred to, page 9 of 11, corrective action request involving requirement 4.2.1. The laboratory shall establish, implement, and maintain a management system appropriate to the scope of its activities. So my first question is, who develops the management system that we're now going to have in the Nassau County latent print unit? Was it you, or did you develop a management system based upon guidelines, rules, and/or regulations from ASCLD Lab?
ASCLD, we developed it through ASCLD Lab. We developed it through the existing DNA program that we had in-house. Mark Gill was responsible for a good portion of it through his expertise, and I want to give credit to the outside laboratories that we've basically have been supported by throughout this whole process.
These management systems that are implicated by 4.2.1, in any of the labs, including and personnel who you depended upon for establishing these management systems, including Mr. Gill, and I don't know his background, I'm sorry. Well, any of the people who develop these management systems, do they have degrees or expertise in putting together management systems in laboratories or scientific laboratories? Do they have degrees from marketing, from Wharton University, anything like that in management systems per se?
I can speak for myself. I do not.
Do you know if any of the people you worked with had that expertise?
Not those types of degrees. I mean, we've had management type trainings through the county and DCJS, but none with a degree.
Okay. And I just have one last question because we have a very crowded agenda. If we vote for this, correct, we're giving you accreditation for the latent print unit. Am I correct?
Correct.
On a prior occasion, when you were here, we were given this document, which is, I think this was your application for accreditation. Do you remember this?
If that's the application that we submitted in, prior to the commission meeting?
Not a trick question. I'll be happy to give it to you, but this is what I was given. I questioned you before.
I'm going to assume that you
Okay.
identified.
On a prior occasion, I asked about this particular document because it had in it a provision that if the defense bar, one of the stakeholders in the criminal justice system, wanted to get into your lab to review materials, they could not do that.
No, that's not true.
Tell me what is true as of today. If a defense attorney in Nassau County calls you up, has a pending case, there's been an indictment, wants to come into the lab, what are the procedures under this potential accreditation that that defense attorney would have to do? And do they differ from the district attorney?
Well, I'm not going to speak on the district attorney's policies, but our policies, the first person would be my immediate, well, my boss, the chief, Dr. Bloom.
Right.
And then at that point would be the county attorneys. And we've had situations in the past where we've had the Innocence Project in-house observing us functioning in DNA. It's not going to change for latent prints.
Let me be a little bit more specific. I'm not asking you to talk about the DA's policies. I'm only talking about your policy. I have a pending felony in Nassau County, a robbery in the first degree. And I'm preparing for trial. And there were latent prints. And I want to see what you guys did. What do I do? Do I call you up under this accreditation and say, I'd like to come over to the lab, I'd like to meet with the technician, I'd like to see all the materials, copy them. Is that all that's needed, is a phone call?
Sure, you can give me a call, but it's not, Marvin, come on in tomorrow. It would be, I have to go through the process. It's county attorney is the deciding organization in Nassau County.
And currently, as of today, have you had requests from the defense bar to look at materials? And have you gone to the county attorney and have the defense bar been refused the ability to see any of these materials?
In latent prints?
Yes.
Or we have not.
There have been no incidents of defense requests, or?
We really haven't been processing much casework.
Okay. But if that happens, and I ask you to come in, you then call the county attorney, correct?
Well, at first I'd clear it with the chief,
Right.
and then the county attorney.
Do you have any reason to believe, as we sit here today, before the commission votes on accreditation, that you would say to your chief, don't let Schechter see this material?
No.
You would-
And from past experiences, there would be no reason to believe that.
You would agree with me that the key to the success of the future Nassau County lab as an entity is transparency.
Absolutely.
Would you agree, and just a quick answer to this, that the ASCLD lab definition of customer in their glossary to their supplemental, which says that the individuals who are your customers are those requesting your services?
Yes.
Would that include the defense bar, the defense attorneys?
Absolutely. And it's even posted on the website. If you have complaints, you have the opportunity to even put in complaints with
And
us.
one last question. If Mr. Fitzpatrick has a case in Nassau County, and he's representing somebody in a robbery in the first degree, and he calls you up and says, I want to see the lab materials, do you follow the same procedure? You would go to Mr. Bloom and then the county attorney for him?
It's a she, and yes, I
I'm
would.
sorry?
Absolutely.
Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're a DA, a defense attorney, everybody's treated the
We
same.
go through the same process, through administration first, and then to the county attorney's office.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike.
Yeah, I'm sorry I arrived late in the middle of this discussion. Can I speak with you on the phone?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So here's my question. The materials that were sent to me yesterday afternoon. I have not had a chance yet, because I was tied up in meetings all yesterday afternoon, to see the data that you sent. But just based on our conversation, the following was disclosed. In the FBI latent print unit now, it is their protocol that when the examiner first looks at the latent print, before he or she examines any ink prints of a possible suspect, that they are required to note all matters of significance, okay? Whether it's an artifact or not an artifact remains to be seen, but they have to note them all. They all get red flagged. And when I think I spoke with you on the phone, and correct me if I'm mistaken, you said that that was not a requirement in Nassau County, but in Nassau County it was up to the individual examiner on a particular case to decide whether he or she felt that the artifact needed reporting in their bench notes. So far, am I right or wrong?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a fundamental problem with that process, and I think it actually compromises the scientific objectivity of your procedure, in that if you leave it up to the examiner on whether or not something rises to the level of what would be an artifact, or at least a nonconformity. You don't know yet whether it's simply an artifact or whether it could be an exclusion. And if it's subjective and completely left to the individual examiner, rather than mandatory like the FBI's protocol, that every one of those minutiae, okay, be recorded, then you're not left with a consistent, standardized, objective policy to deal with the very real phenomena of cognitive bias. Okay? The whole reason that the FBI implemented that program was to reduce the danger of cognitive bias. And if you allow that decision-making process to be completely left to the examiner, the cognitive bias is still there. Not only is it still there, but when an independent examiner or a defense counsel wants to look at it, they will not know about certain observations which went unrecorded, unlike the FBI analysis. So I guess the first question is, why did you choose not to follow the FBI's protocol? Okay.
So essentially, there's two separate things that you brought up. As far as the FBI protocols are concerned, we've looked into that matter a little bit more in depth. There's a requirement that they note artifacts only in certain types of cases. So it's not a requirement for every case. Similarly, during our examination process, the examiner can annotate artifacts that they feel are relevant to the examination. The artifacts are that are relevant will be recorded, and there is suggestions in our manuals to record those when it's there, and the image is within the case record.
That was one thing that I was going to interject, was that we do include the image, because we've been in and the conversation is too new at this point, and I know you and I weren't able to get in touch with each other. It's something that we definitely would like to continue our discussions. It's just not something possible that we can have put together before the commission meeting today. But we looked into it with the FBI, and it doesn't seem like it's mandated by the FBI. And one of the things that you know we have put in place is the fact that we're going to include every image in the case. And from my understanding of late prints is that the majority of late prints do have some form of an artifact. Some of them have no effect on the identification. However, the ones that do, the trained examiner would comment in their case notes.
But is it Mark? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. But Mark, two things. One is, in certain classes of cases, it's not discretionary, it's mandatory at the FBI that they record all those differences, whether or not they're artifacts or whether they are, in fact, significant differences which might rise to the level of exclusion, right?
They qualify that as only complex latent print cases that result in identifications.
Okay.
So their definition of complex, I'm not sure what.
I understand, but at least there is a class of cases where it's mandatory.
Sure.
And what you're saying is that in all of your cases, okay, it's never mandatory. it's up to the subjective judgment of the examiner as to whether or not this is a difference that warrants recording. Am I right about that?
Correct.
This distinction between the approach you were taking and the approach of the FBI, I think was brought up by my colleague Barry Scheck 2 meetings ago here, not just at the last meeting, but 2 meetings ago. So it's not something that, you're just being notified of right now. I personally think that that is a very significant departure from what is necessary scientific practice to ensure objectivity and to reduce the danger of cognitive bias. And I don't understand why, if this was brought to your attention, now I assume it's been several months since Barry first brought it up, why you haven't adopted it.
Well, for one is I wasn't, and I'm not going by what Barry had stated during the meeting. It was from the last meeting what you had expressed to us. I didn't really have an understanding of what you were asking, and that's why we were trying to get in touch with each other. And it's something that Mark and I discussed yesterday.
Although there were two separate issues. The issue about cognitive bias and the subjective determination by an analyst to record or not to record observations on the print was something that Barry brought up 2 meetings ago. What I brought up at the last meeting was that if this was a civil case under Rule 26, or even frankly a federal criminal case under Rule 16, that the way you were writing your reports would not meet those federal criteria. And that was a subject that you and I were going to follow up on, but we kept missing each other.
And we will.
I understand, okay? But the other issue remained out there was a very important issue of quality assurance and quality control, and it just hasn't been addressed. And it's a very, very important issue because the problem of cognitive bias is probably, the single greatest cause of miscalls of either inclusion or exclusion in the area of forensic fingerprinting. And if the Bureau has decided after a joint inquiry of NIST and NIJ, and after 3 go-arounds with the Department of Justice Inspector General about what types of protocols were needed to prevent the problem of cognitive bias, for our laboratories not to learn from that kind of lengthy quality assurance experience, I think is a recipe for disaster. And I don't think we should accredit a laboratory that has not moved on that kind of learning moment, which has been going on now for several months.
Peter, we're addressing the cognitive bias issue by we'll perform annotations on the latent prior to looking at the exemplar record, so there's no bias in that regard. Is that what you're referring to as
Are
cognitive
those
bias?
annotations mandatory?
Those are mandatory.
They are. And that's actually, it's written in the card.
But to the extent that there are differences observed between the latent and the reference print, that's what's subjective? That's left to the analyst?
During the whole annotation process, the latent is annotated up front. When the latent is compared to the exemplar, differences will be noted, and if additional points are used, those are clearly indicated.
No, but the problem was, I thought that initially when the examiner looked at the latent, that they didn't have to record, that there was a subjective element in terms of what they had to note and not note, right?
Well, now that there's a requirement that they annotate the latent during the analysis phase.
Even on
But
exclusions.
when does the subjective factor come into play then, that you mentioned to me on the telephone yesterday?
Well, as far as which points they choose, each examiner has different sets of points on a print that they might choose to use, so it's not a standard recipe to come to a right conclusion. There's various ways to come to the correct conclusion.
So during the comparison and verification process, the verifier could select additional points that may not have been chosen by the person involved in the comparison.
And the verifier does it blindly without seeing the first person's work.
Correct. That's correct.
And the verifier could not just choose additional points, the verifier could, in theory, choose different points.
Right.
I mean,
Right,
not
that's the
additional,
subjective.
and actually reject, if you will, the points that were chosen by the first examiner. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
In that instance, though, both the first person and the verifier are going to record the points that's going to be documented?
That's correct.
On inclusions and also on exclusions now. We've added exclusions also.
So let me just be clear, what is it that Peter is driving at? Is there something that's going to be left out that's based upon the discretion of the examiner?
I just,
I
I
can't
gotta ask you to
question.
rephrase, he can't answer what Peter's driving.
Well, let me ask you, what, as it currently stands, under all the procedures, when a latent is compared, what does the examiner have discretion to leave out? The first examiner.
You know, at this point, now that everything is annotated, I'm not quite sure if anything is being left out.
Marvin, just, and I apologize, it may have been my inartful asking of the question. So maybe the simpler question is this, after that circle that we just made, okay? And Mark can answer this, okay? In what respect, with respect to least complex cases, okay, is your procedure different from the FBI's procedure for the for when things get annotated and when they don't?
Annotation is required on every latent image.
And what is the difference between the FBI's protocol and yours?
There's certain artifacts that, such as tonal reversal, such as pressure depositions. There's certain artifacts that are required to be recorded. There's others that, if the analyst feels it's relevant to the examination, that they will record. A lot of these features in a latent are hard to distill down to a checkbox, so they have the ability to perform written notes.
Annotate in their notes.
So in other words, so in the FBI, they are required then to note certain classes of observed phenomena on the latent, right?
For certain types of cases.
For certain types of cases. And for that same class of cases, your analysts are not required to note the existence of each of those specific phenomena unless he or she deems it relevant.
Correct.
Okay. I think that's a fundamental problem. But
Mr. Chair. If I could
Hang on,
comment.
if I can, just, I think we've got a technical issue. Can the people in Albany who are supposedly participating by video conference here? I guess the answer is no on that. Do we have anyone who can help us with that here? I guess not.
Hi, yes, we can hear you.
You can hear us?
Yeah, hear us.
All right. We can hear you now, yeah.
no, that's okay.
I guess they're indicating they can hear now.
Okay.
Louis?
All right, do we have any other questions to ask on this?
To comment. I share Peter's concern. If there's a deviation in practice from the FBI standard, they should be addressed. But my point is that ASCLAD Lab has evaluated NASA against its standard. We're using its standard. And if we are to address your concerns, Peter, we need to do that in a systematic way for all laboratories doing latent prints. So my preference would be that this commission take up your concerns and address them systematically and adopt them as requirements by this commission, but not to hold at this point in time NASA to perhaps a higher standard than presently required by ASCLAD Lab.
The only response I would have with that, Richard, is I look at this over a 15-year history, and we haven't done that, to my knowledge, in other disciplines, in other protocols, ever. And you know, what we've done historically is we, unfortunately, have simply deferred with a blank check to ASCLAD Lab on all of these things. What's wrong with saying, no, we're going to now act differently, and we can do both. We can say that we're going to require them to adopt this. I mean, frankly, we would have the power, I would assume, maybe this is a compromise, that we could give them the conditional approval on the condition, right, that they adopt that FBI protocol that we're describing, which makes it mandatory. And then we'll take it up and make it statewide. But if we don't start someplace, it'll just be another year or a year and a half where we're not doing best practices. And you may get wrongful exclusions or wrongful inclusions in the interim.
Well, I hope this commission is presently staged to take on the challenge of addressing the weaknesses in our oversight. And that's on today's agenda, and I hope that it becomes a priority for this commission. But if we were to act on Nassau presently for not being in full compliance with the FBI guideline, then we'd have to do the same for all of the laboratories presently doing latent prints not in full compliance with FBI.
But even now, we have different standards, okay? Whether you're on a legacy or the other aspect approach, we have a two-tier approach in New York, or we did for some period of time, and we allowed that. I'm not suggesting prohibiting it. I'm just simply saying that we have the power to add another condition. So why can't you give them the provisional approval and make a condition of the provisional approval that they adopt the FBI protocol on that narrow area that we've just discussed? So they would still get provisional approval, but they would have to use that additional best practice.
Well, I would agree to that if, in fact, we do the same for all the other presently approved laboratories, that have them acknowledge whether they're in compliance, and if not, then their accreditation or approval is provisional.
So we could do that today, in other words. We could, if we have the power.
We couldn't do that today. We can't take accreditation away from the labs that we have without giving them a hearing.
No, it's not taking accreditation away. It's just a question of we have
Well,
oversight.
We're taking away their accreditation that they have. We're saying now you have provisional accreditation, or if you don't do this, you don't have your accreditation any longer.
No, Gina, I'm not saying that. I'm just simply saying, since we have the power to set whatever standards we want, okay, for laboratories, what's to prevent us from saying, yes, you continue to have your accreditation, the other 18 laboratories, but this commission is now saying that we want you by July 1st to add to your protocol X.
The other issue this raises.
And then if they don't, then they get a hearing, then we'll have an issue. But right now, we wouldn't have an issue.
The other issue this raises, as a commission, I think we have the power to say, as part of accreditation, we're going to require labs to adopt the FBI protocol with regard to noting of artifacts and latent prints in certain types of cases. But I think if we're going to do that, we should put it as an item on the agenda. We should give people notice so people can prepare for it, and we can have an intelligent discussion on it, and then we can vote on it. And certainly if you want that added as an agenda item on the agenda for the next meeting, I think that's absolutely legitimate, and we can do that. But to bring it up today and say that we want to discuss it and take a vote on it today, when the rest of the commission wasn't on notice that this was going to be an issue, I don't think it's fair to the rest of the commission.
But Michael, this issue, in all fairness, was brought up by Barry two meetings ago as an issue, okay?
Barry said that he wanted the commission to address this as a standard for all labs going forward. I believe this is the first time I've heard.
No, what Barry addressed was the fact that the proposed protocol by Nassau County, this was several months ago, was not in line with the recently improved protocols of the FBI latent print unit. And all I'm asking, just as a point of, I guess, of legal clarification, Gina, and just answer it. I mean, in addition to us accrediting and saying you're accredited or you're not accredited, can we say, as a commission, your accreditation continues, but effective such and such a date, we are going to, in addition to your ASCLD accreditation, we're going to, to require that everybody in the lab wear red jackets. Do we have that power?
We do have that power, and we have that power through the regulatory process, and we have done that with the mid-cycle legacy inspection. So we can promulgate a reg that says you have to do X, Y, Z. Yes.
So I'm not.
But there's a process to do it.
Okay, so I'm not suggesting then that this become a condition of accreditation for those other laboratories. I'm just asking that we do that, and I think we actually shared the contents 2 meetings ago of the U.S. Department of Justice Inspector General's report, which preceded the FBI then implementing new protocols and procedures for for the analysis of latent fingerprints. I think we shouldn't just keep postponing things.
So are you asking that we add as an agenda item on the next meeting's agenda, adopt a requirement requiring laboratories as a condition of accreditation for latent fingerprints to adopt the FBI protocol or procedure with regard to the noting of artifacts on major cases or whatever terminology they use?
Or to go further. I think that I think you're right. Everybody on the commission is not at this point up to speed on that issue. Okay, and so to vote on that would not necessarily be a well-informed vote. I grant you that. So at the next meeting, I'm sorry. At the next meeting, in terms of all the other laboratories in the state, I do think that we should have a vote on whether or not we wish to require, okay, separate and apart from ASLAD Lab, best practices to the extent that we deem appropriate that we've learned from what the FBI has gone through and the protocols that they've now implemented.
We will add that, let me deal with this first. We'll add that as an agenda item for the next meeting, and what I would ask is that well in advance of the next meeting, as soon as you can, get us your proposal in writing so that we can circulate it to the rest of the commissioners. And if you have any background material that you think is relevant for people to review before then as well, if you get that to us as well.
Sure. In that regard, you should know that you circulated, or your predecessor circulated, I can't remember because I have no sense of time anymore, the current protocols of the FBI was circulated to every member of this commission at least a couple of months ago.
If you have obviously something in mind that you want us to vote on, just so there's no misunderstanding, no miscommunication, get us what it is that you're proposing, that you want the commission to vote on. Get us any background materials that you think are relevant
Sure.
for the commissioners to review before the meeting. We'll circulate that, and it'll be an agenda item on the next meeting. Marvin?
With this proviso, that in fairness to the laboratories that are under the jurisdiction of the commission, that the chair send a letter to all the laboratories inviting them to respond to this proposal, either in writing or by attending the next commission meeting to speak on the proposal.
I assume we could do that through, okay. Is that acceptable with you if we do it through NICLAG?
Sure. Okay.
I mean, I think this is not a bad conversation to have, but I do think it's, to be completely fair, I think we need to have really the lab directors considered input and more than just a written submission. I mean, I think we need to have some time on this. I feel it's somewhat like an imposition on these lab directors, and how will it affect cases in the pipeline? How will it affect, the employees that are doing this? What long-term consequences will it have? I mean, in a way, it's, what will we be changing within the lab itself? And I think ultimately it's not a bad idea, but I feel like we're hearing one side and maybe not considering things that will happen within the lab itself. And I know Dr. Prado might have some thoughts right now, but in a week she may have a lot more thoughts.
I absolutely agree, but the only way we're going to get that type of input is to get it on the agenda and start the process. And the fact that it's on the agenda, we may or may not get to a vote next meeting, but we'll certainly have a discussion. By notifying the lab directors, we'll start to get that input. So I understand your point, and it's a good point, but I think this is the way the process starts.
A couple things I want to point out. One is I just want to clarify something that was said by Dr. Jenny. The FBI, if they're FBI protocols, they're not standards, and there is a difference. Okay, so just so everyone in the room understands that. There are SWIG-FAST guidelines, which are more akin to standards, but the FBI, what we're speaking about, what Peter's speaking about, is the FBI protocols.
Right.
The second thing is I agree with what Mr. Murphy said. I think we definitely need to give the labs a chance to digest this and respond to it, because I think all of the labs realize this is good practice, and many of the labs might already be doing a lot of this anyway. The issue, though, is it's going to take a lot of time, and it's going to take a lot of effort, and it will, and I'm saying up front, it is definitely a good practice, but please realize by implementing all these things, we are going to increase the amount of time it takes to complete a case, and that will increase the backlogs. So I think that's something that needs to be addressed. Let me finish, please. And the other thing I want to say, and I know I say this at every meeting, but I feel completely remiss if I don't bring this up. There are, I think, 4 labs in the state, I don't know if you want that, but I think there's 4 labs currently that are accredited latent prints. There are over 100 other entities in the state that perform latent print analysis. They are under no obligation to follow any guideline at all. They have no standards that they have to follow. They don't have to document, you know, we're talking about documenting the, annotating the minutia and all that, which is a great practice, but they don't even have to document what their result was, whether it was an ID or an elimination. The amount of effort that the labs are doing is so far and above what many of these agencies are doing. And I think if we are going to bring the discussion in to bring the labs up even higher, which is always good to improve, we really should include in the discussion, this commission, I've been on this commission, we've talked about this over and over. Somebody needs to address this issue, that latent prints in the state need to be looked at. It's not just the laboratories. If you want to bring the laboratories up from a 95 to a 99, great. But what about some of these other agencies that are down at a 10 or a 15? We need to move those up. And I don't think we should have these discussions without including that as part of it. You know, obviously it's a different discussion, but I think it needs to be included.
I think, Gina, I mean, correct me if I'm mistaken on this, it's a simple issue of the statute. Correct. The reason those other laboratories are not under our jurisdiction is when the statute was enacted, there was a carve-out.
Yes.
And we were limited only to the official laboratories and not to police departments. So not just from the area of latent print examination, but also ballistics.
It's just for latent prints.
There's not an issue like that for ballistics?
Crime scenes, arson.
Crime scene is not necessarily accreditable.
Right.
You don't have to be accredited.
But arson.
Right.
In
So
other words,
the
arson
only carve-out
inspectors.
in the statute is for latent prints.
What about arson?
But
There's no carve-out.
it's not a carve-out, but it's a de facto double standard, if you will, right? For those other disciplines.
It's there, but
because
there's
they're not
no
being
carve-out
done.
in the statute.
Okay. But even to do the kind of fix that Kathy's talking about would require a statutory remedy.
Correct.
Right. What I would also suggest, Michael, is in addition to those people that you invite the head of the latent print unit at the FBI to come. So perhaps he or she could address some of Jim's questions about how long it took to implement the changes, what were the unexpected consequences of the changes, just so you'll have a complete data set before you when you make those assessments.
Any other comments or questions? Do you have questions for NASA or comments before we vote? All right, if there's nothing else, then do we have a motion with regard to a vote to extend the scope with regard to NASA to include latent fingerprints?
So moved.
Do we have a second? All in favor? Anybody opposed? All right, I see 3 opposed. It's Peter, Barry, and Marvin. All right. So that passes. So your scope is extended to include latents.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Michael, I didn't even know. Is there anybody voting in Albany?
I don't
One way or the
know.
other?
We're all here.
We're all here?
We're all here.
Okay.
Isn't that nice? I believe our next issue is the Yonkers Police Department Forensic Laboratory. And Kathy, do you want to give us an update there?
Yes, this is a request from Yonkers. They're moving from their legacy to their international accreditation program. Their current legacy accreditation will expire September 13th, 2002. They do have I think they have the assessment scheduled in June, next week, I guess. And but there's going to be a gap, probably. We won't meet until, even if they get a few corrective actions, they might not complete those before the September meeting, usually because ASPA Lab will give them 90 days. And since we do not have a December meeting scheduled for the commission yet, they did request 90-day extensions to cover that gap in accreditation. However, I think you maybe should want to go to 100 days and reach it out till maybe, so that it's covered through December 22nd. It's very possible we might have a commission meeting December 18th. That will allow them to complete any remediation if they have some, and in order not to have that, this is more of a scheduling conflict with the commission and accreditation.
Do we have anyone from Yonkers here?
Chris Cheney is the lab director from Yonkers, who's here.
Do we have any either questions for Yonkers on this or any discussion on this item? All right, if there's not, do we have a motion to vote to grant? I would say you're recommending to be safe 100 day extension.
Yeah, 100 days to December 22nd.
All right, do we have a motion to grant a 100-day extension? All right, do we have a second on that? All right, all in favor? Aye. Anybody opposed? All right, that passes. Thank you. Right, the next item, I believe on our agenda, relates to the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. Again, Kathy.
Yes, this is their accreditation from ABFT. They have a 2-year cycle, and they recently had an inspection, as well as they had completed any corrective actions. I do have Bob Oshowitz, I hope, on the phone from Buffalo. Bob, are you there?
Yes, I am.
This won't bring you up.
They had two essentials that needed to be corrected prior to granting accreditation. And you have those materials in your binder. As well as, I think I had it on the table, there was a final letter that we received from ABFT dated June 13th, granting accreditation.
Do we have any either questions regarding the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office Forensic Toxicology Lab, or any discussion on this item? Yes.
Good morning, Bob. Dick Jenny.
Good morning.
The issue that was identified was an error in proficiency testing where you had reported a false negative for acetaminophen, correct?
Correct.
And the reason for that failure to detect or report acetaminophen was because, can you walk us through what happened?
Yes. This acetaminophen is part of a screening test of 55 different drugs. For acetaminophen is a targeted analysis, and we have a cutoff calibrator at a therapeutic concentration of 10 milligrams per liter. And this is determined by the use of a calibration table where this value of 10 milligrams per liter is entered into. So if it's above that, it would give you a value in the actual sample of whatever it is in a semi-quantitative fashion. We use that to determine whether we should go on for confirmation or just not report it. In this particular case, the value that was targeted by the proficiency program was approximately 50 milligrams per deciliter, if I recall properly. 50 milligrams per liter. Because the calibration table had become corrupt, it was rebuilt in July of 2011. Unfortunately, the value of 10,000 or 10 milligrams was put in there as 1 milligram. Actually, it was left, a zero was left out of the number. And therefore, the values that were being recorded by the instrument were 1/10 of its actual value. So based upon the finding by the inspectors that, excuse me, that that we had missed the proficiency, this triggered us to go back and look at 547 cases that were analyzed, which was approximately 70% of all the cases we received during that period of time. So we went back and looked at approximately 550 cases that had been analyzed using this technique since this calibration table had been rebuilt. And of those, we found 9 cases that, based upon the correct semi-quantitative values, were something that we should have pursued. 8 of those cases, or one of those cases, we did actually go on for quantitation based upon other information. So of the 7 cases that were left, that exceeded our decision point, 2 of those cases, unfortunately, the samples had been discarded because they were considered natural deaths. And the pathologist, reviewing the information with the pathologist, the pathologist did not feel that any of our semi-quantitative values that we reported to them would have impacted on their decision. The other 6 cases, we did go back and reanalyze as we had remaining samples. We did go back and reanalyze them, and the values range from approximately 30 milligrams to 100 milligrams, which is probably would be considered high therapeutic to low toxic. Again, discussing all of this with the pathologist, and not any of the cases did they feel that the acetaminophen concentrations that we finally determined would have changed their thought process and the cause and manner of the deaths of those individuals.
Okay, thank you. I have 2 questions. The first, why didn't your quality control program detect the corrupt calibration file?
Well, at that time, for those few drugs that we had a determined cutoff concentration for. In other words, we were using that information to whether to go on for follow-up confirmation or not, or follow-up confirmation quantitation. Well, all of those 55 drugs, there's about 4 or 5 drugs that are actually in this category. Unfortunately, at that time, we did not have a separate control run with it. We ran two cutoff calibrators, and again, we used those to decide whether, in fact, there was a drug present and an approximate concentration. But unfortunately, we did not have a separate positive control being run that was made up from a different stock. We have now included that in our assay as a result of this error.
Okay. Did you review systematically all of your assays in the laboratory for similar problems?
Yes, we have. That's the only assay that at this point we are using in a semi-quantitative fashion.
So you have reviewed all of your assays for or verified the calibration?
Right. Essentially, yes, sir. We have reviewed those that use a cutoff to determine this process. To determine this error.
And do you presently include quality control material for all other assays?
Yes, we do.
Okay. One last question. You mentioned that it was the inspection team that brought to light the proficiency testing error. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes, sir.
And it was through their observation that you, in fact, conducted an investigation. To what extent is the ABFT accreditation committee involved in review of laboratory proficiency testing?
They get our results directly from the CAP program that we are involved in. I can't speak for how extensive they review this.
Okay. All right, thank you. I will comment when this comes to vote. We do need to vote on continued accreditation.
Do you have any other questions?
I would like to comment that well, okay, based on this discussion, thanks, Bob. No comment.
Do we have any other comments before a vote? All right, I think, do we have a motion then to grant the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office of the Forensic Toxicology Laboratory accreditation? I believe it would be a 2-year accreditation, is that correct?
Right.
All right, do we have a motion? All right, do we have a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Anybody opposed? All right, that passes unanimously. Okay, our next issue is the Monroe County Office of the Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. Kathy?
This laboratory was also up for a 2-year accreditation to toxicology. Dr. Gene Vino is in Albany to answer any questions if you have any. We received also a June 13th letter, which put on your, sign your binder, but put in front of you today, that did grant accreditation from ABFT. There were no essential requirements all essential requirements were met with this inspection. But if you do have any questions for Dr. Vino, she's available.
Does anyone have any questions for Dr. Vino or any comment? Yes.
Well, Dr. Vino? Gene?
I'm here, Dick, yes.
Hi. My only comment is that as a result of the inspection, recommendations were made by the inspection team suggesting that you improve your practices to reduce risk for contamination.
That's correct.
Have you adopted those recommendations?
Yes. Well, while they were there, we modified our log that records all the samples and the protocols for your quality control in the run. And on that, we included, excuse me, a space to note that the evaporator needles were cleaned before the run, before the evaporation, and to record all temperatures relevant in the run. So, for example, if you have an initial evaporation, what temperature that was done at, if you derivatized, what temperature that was done at, and then if you have a re-evaporation after derivatization, another spot to record that temperature. Those changes in that form were actually made before the inspectors left. There was one more change that we initially said, sure, we can change that, and that was the issue of cleaning the faceplate on the solid phase extraction manifold. This is a positive pressure manifold that comes down over your solid phase extraction tubes, which are plastic tubes that have a little flat lip on them that allow them to sit in the manifold. Now, we didn't really see any reason why those lips, which aren't exposed to the sample, would really contaminate that faceplate, but we thought, oh, there's no problem with wiping that down. We started that procedure and found that when you wipe down that faceplate, it retains that little bit of moisture or causes some kind of problem, so that after you've pressurized the manifold and processed your samples, when you go to release that faceplate, your tubes tend to stick to the top of that faceplate and then abruptly fall down, and now you have problems that didn't exist before. where the sample can splash up and out, or you can cause problems that didn't exist previously. So we've stopped doing that, but the rest of those requests we adopted.
Right. Thank you. My only comment is it's somewhat disappointing that ABFT didn't require or expect a response from you. It would be helpful to this commission to have documentation of the corrective action that you've taken. And I think it's entirely appropriate what you've done, and thank you for doing that. But it's more a criticism of ABFT and its requirements for documentation. I'm not even certain that ABFT required that you make those changes. I just wanted to put that on the record. Thank you.
Could I just make one last comment? I mean, we will be sending a letter to ABFT detailing, every change that we made, but their letter to us just came just over a week ago, so we haven't had the opportunity to do that yet.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Dr. Bino? Thank you, Doctor. Any comments before we vote? There's no other questions or comments, and we have a motion to grant the Erie County Medical Examiner's Office of the Forensic Toxicology Laboratory accreditation. Again, this would be for a 2-year period. Monroe County, I'm sorry. All right, do we have a second? Right. All in favor? Anybody opposed? All right, thank you, that's granted. The next item on our agenda relates to the Suffolk County Office of the Chief Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. Kathy?
Yeah, this is also a 2-year accreditation from ABFT for forensic toxicology. And I just want to make a point that was brought up at the last meeting. It was a question regarding, I think it was from Dr. Staish, regarding why we did not have their mid-cycle inspection in our annual reporting. Just want to make we did receive it. We received it in February of 2012, and this is why it wasn't tracked in the 2011 annual reporting. I just want to put that on the record. Their inspection and accreditation letter is included in your packet. All essential requirements were met. Mike Katz, he's the assistant lab director, and he is here. If you have any questions, you want to direct them toward him.
Do you have any questions with regard to the Suffolk County Medical Examiner's Toxicology Lab, or any discussion or comment?
He is here?
Yeah.
There were 2 findings in inspection, both, I believe, evaluated as important standards rather than essential. Frankly, I would differ with that categorization. The first being that in your method validation, even though you conducted the studies, the findings were not applied to any acceptance criteria. You had no specifications for assay performance. My question is, how, in fact, would you judge a method to be validated when there's no documentation that, in fact, it meets accuracy or precision requirements or specificity requirements?
Well, we do have specifications. What ABFT suggested is to be more specific about criteria for new assays, things that were being developed now. Many of the assays that we have been, in fact, developed and monitored over many years, and were considered validated by daily performance of calibrators, controls. We're in the process of complying by making more specific criteria in terms of precision, accuracy, limited detection, limited quantitation, and what we do now for new assays. So we are in the process of modifying making a more specific validation protocol.
Well, again, that's an important standard. According to the letter from ABFT, they're not really expecting that you respond to the observation of not fully documented validation. It is your intent to
Yes.
follow that recommendation? Perhaps is the timing again. This letter was June 4 from ABFTs. There's no response to this inspection report. You're in the process of
Yes.
compiling that.
Well, I think most of it was not that we don't validate things, but we don't necessarily have the specific criteria in writing of what that entails. It was not that we don't
Which is
validate.
very important. The second was mass spectral identification. You have, according to the inspector, no criteria for the evaluation of full scan spectrum.
I think what they more objected to was a statement about having it, and then not, we do describe it in terms of analytical judgment and not a specific number of criteria, because depending upon the sample that you're evaluating, it's very difficult to always get a specific numerical criteria for what's acceptable and what's not, depending upon the complexity of the spectra, the type of sample that you're analyzing, whether that sample has any other confirmatory data to back it up. So we do rely to some degree on judgment, on retention time. I believe they objected to a statement in the SOP that they really thought should come out. It wasn't so much our criteria, but the fact that we referred to it and it didn't, that statement didn't apply.
Well, ABFT guidance is that for a match to be considered positive, all the major and diagnostic ions present in the known reference spectrum must be present in the unknown. Is that in fact part of your SOP?
Yes.
You'll be responding as well to
Yes.
ABFT. And we will receive a copy of that correspondence? Okay, thank you.
I just have a question to see if I understand this correctly. So the criticism was that in terms of the validation, you say you did the validation, but it just wasn't written down?
No, is that in our SOP, we don't have as detailed a criteria of what goes into a validation as they deemed that we should. Not that we didn't do the validation or didn't have the data to back it up. They looked at all the assays that we had validated since our last inspection. They felt that we should be more specific about how and have a specified protocol about how we validate our assays.
But when they looked at your documentation, did they actually see something that said, here's our validation study, and here are, and they could actually look at it, it was written down, and they would be able to...
Oh, absolutely.
It just wasn't in your
SOP as detailed as they wanted it.
Well, I guess I'm confused now. My understanding from the citation was that you generated the data, but you did not interpret the data.
I think this
So
is the
imprecision.
same question.
So for instance, in doing the testing, the imprecision of an assay in your lab may have been 30%. In that you didn't weigh whether in fact 30% is acceptable for the intended use of the assay.
No, that wasn't the case. I thought they wanted a more detailed protocol in the SOP.
So you do apply specifications, they're just not written.
Well, they're not as detailed as they would like it.
Any other questions? Any other comment or discussion with regard to Suffolk County? Anything further? All right, do we have a motion with regard to the Suffolk County Office of the Chief Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory grant accreditation for, again, it'll be a 2-year period?
So moved.
Do we have a second? Second. All right, all in favor? Anybody opposed? All right, that's great. Okay, one abstention. All right, thank you. That's everything for our accreditations and lab updates. So the next item is new business. The first item, the first item deals with Monroe County. Oh, I'm sorry. The first item is the Nassau County Office of the Medical Examiner. Kathy, do you have an update on that?
This is just for informational purposes only, that the Nassau County Medical Examiner's Office of Forensic Toxicology will be moving from ASCLD lab accreditation to ABFT. This is just a notification of that. Dr. Joe Avila is here if you have any questions for him regarding it.
This is not an item at this point that requires any.
No, not at all. It's just for your information. They will have dual accreditation for a while until they get accredited by ABFT. Joe, I think they want you at.
Anyone have any questions?
Yes.
Are you presently international?
No, we're legacy.
So it's a decision whether to move from legacy to international or legacy to
ABFT. Correct.
And it's your judgment that the ABFT is a more rigorous program and more pertinent to your laboratory operations as compared to ASCLD Lab?
Well, I'll use the words, we give a little background, I guess. Since I became the director in the laboratory, we began to adopt a number of the protocols or practices that ABFT would recognize probably as good practices, and they put up their recommendations. It's consistent with their recommendations and requirements. They can do that because the specificity that just looking at toxicology labs, it allows them to do that. So as we've migrated in that direction, it's come to the point where so long as we're doing the things that ABFT would recognize, at this point we probably should just go ahead and become accredited by that organization.
So I'm taking this letter, or I'm reviewing this letter and taking the opportunity to comment on my observations of ABFT, in that ASCLD Lab, in review of the Nassau County FED, it was evident that ASCLD Lab, in fact, the program evolved. Every couple of years, its requirements were updated. In fact, they moved from a legacy to a far more rigorous international program. I've been on this board now since 2005, and I don't believe ABFT has updated its program since 2006. So in that regard, ABFT, if I'm speaking out of line here, please let me know, Marina, but ABFT has not updated its program. And many of those practices that are very important to this commission, monitoring of testimony, technical review. I know ABFT requires data review. ABFT, or ASCLD Lab, is very clear that in technical review, those doing the review are not an author of the documents being reviewed. ABFT only states that there is a need for data review. There's no requirement that, in fact, the person who generated the report is not prohibited from conducting that data review. The point of this is that among the recommendations in response to the OIG report is that even though we've been very critical of ASCLD Lab through these past couple of years, we haven't paid a lot of attention to ABFT. And among the recommendations is that, in fact, we do critically review ABFT and hold it to minimum requirements that this commission establishes over time. So it's not so much, you do what you need to do, and I assume that this decision was made with your upper management.
When you're finished. First of all, there are a number of things that we are going to retain from the ASCLD program, which we felt which we're hoping to pick the best of both. Whether or not ABFT specifically, you used the example of review and who could review. Whether or not ABFT specifically says that an author cannot review, we certainly would never have allowed that as an ABFT lab or as an ASCLD lab. So whether or not they specifically state that, we would not use that practice. And I'm not aware that other laboratories would use that practice. As I said, intend to retain those things that we believe are useful from ASCLD Labs, such as our review of the quality system on an annual basis. I think it's an excellent practice. But the ABFT standards do, there are some specific requirements, especially as they relate to the quality system, that not that an ASCLD lab could not adopt those, but ABFT specifically requires certain things. So in my opinion, yes, it is at this point the way for us to go.
I acknowledge there are strengths of the ABFT. There are also weaknesses, and that's true of ASCLD Lab as well. But ASCLD Lab has done well, in my opinion, in adopting ISO international standards and concepts of quality management, whereas ABFT, I believe, is quite weak along those lines and needs considerable updating.
Any other discussion with regard to Nassau County? All right, thank you for the update, we appreciate it.
Can I just make a comment regarding Dr. Jenny's comment? And actually, I think Betsy Spratt is here. Maybe Betsy can comment on this because she was both accredited by ASCLD Lab and now by ABFT. ASCLD Lab, with all due respect, cannot devote that much attention to each discipline as ABFT does. And I wonder if some of the labs that are ASCLD Lab accredited in toxicology could pass an ABFT inspection. So whereas I agree with you that we have not made that many changes, one of the reasons is that some of those changes were not really necessary. And the other reason is, I pointed it out last time, I believe, that we're waiting for the NAS report has actually set us back because we're waiting for the SWIG recommendations to do the updates. But I don't know, maybe Betsy can comment briefly on why they switched from ASCLD Lab to ABFT.
As you know, I started with Dr. Jenny years ago in the health department and his requirements. So I had clinical background, and at the time we did ASCLD Lab as well. We then went to ABFT because it is a more rigorous rules in order to get the work done. I mean, ASCLD Lab has, I've left ASCLD Lab only because it's a money issue, a people issue, and the only thing I left with and got rid of was one specific comment, which was initialing every page. So the rules are much stricter for what you have to do for standards, controls, compared to the other rules, which are very important for review of people testifying. And we do have rules where the same person can't review the work that's been done by themselves. I mean, they do review it, but they're not the person who then signs for it. I am also on the federal SWIG Talks group. We are working very diligently. The validation method should be out for public comment very soon. So I've been involved in all of that as well. So we've chosen to stick with just ABFT, but we aren't really dropping a lot of the ASCLD Lab, things like reviewing testimony and things like that. So I know they're important, but ABFT is really important in how the science is done and the quality control.
Well, again, I will acknowledge the strengths and the weaknesses, but the comment validation presently asked for ABFT requires validation of routinely used assays. That begs the question, if the laboratory were to begin to test for bath salts or synthetic cannabinoids, there's a case and there's an urgent need for an assay, whether an ABFT lab would require, or ABFT would require validation of the method. It's not routine. ASCLD Lab, as I understand it, would require validation before they use that method.
But for good laboratory practices, if you're going to do a new assay, you have to do some level of validation.
No, I'm just looking at the documents and the standards. I can't speak to how they're applied, but as a commission member, you look at guidance, you look at the standards, and there's a bright line between what ASCLD Lab is saying, that methods be validated, and ABFT has that qualifier, only if they are routinely used. Those methods are routinely used.
But if you're just starting and it's a new drug, which we get all the time in toxicology, you have to do a level of validation to even try to bring that assay in. So you would have to do a validation, even though you may do it twice a year, you still have to validate that you can get the correct answers.
I know you perform good lab practice. I'm speaking of the ABFT program
rules.
and the standard. How they apply it, well, I would appreciate guidance on how it's actually applied, but that's the way it's stated. If they're routinely used, then they need to be validated, which opens the door to, introducing methods without validation. I don't, for a moment, believe that any of our tox labs are using assays that haven't been validated, but ABFT needs to address the standard.
What might be helpful, maybe if Marina and Richard and some of your colleagues, if you could actually, help us take a look at ABFT and AskLab as far as the tox is concerned, and sort of lay out what the differences are, and then maybe we can, systematically see if there are any. And
I believe that Betsy was scheduled a long time ago to give a presentation to this commission.
I was.
And I really don't, I was waiting for that and looking forward to it, and I don't know why that kept getting postponed, and it never happened.
Yeah, I think that would be very
But it was
helpful.
supposed to happen a couple of years ago.
I like your suggestion though, Barry. I think even before the presentation, I think it would help.
We just,
And I don't know, Doctor, if that's something that you can do, but something you could pull together something for us so we can look at that lays out the differences between the two with regard to tax labs. I think it would be helpful.
Well, could we put Betsy's presentation on the agenda for next time?
I'm not available in September, so I'm sorry.
I was going to say, I hate to put on for next time, but what I'd
Okay,
suggest
well-
is let's take a look at that first, and then, as a follow-up, if the commission wants to hear the presentation, we can certainly add it after that.
Well, if you'd like to charge Marina and myself with that task. I need collaboration. I'm not ABFT accredited.
Well, why don't you put together what you consider your criticisms, and then I'll work with you to clarify.
All right, great.
And I can also forward my presentation that I put together to both of you so that you have an idea of what I've already put together for you.
Okay, that would be great.
We'll just put this on the agenda, on the next agenda, just for an update, not for a presentation.
Just a suggestion that perhaps Dr. Avella could be included, since he is ASCLD and ABFT. I think you also need an ASCLD. I know you weren't Betsy, but
No,
you're
absolutely.
currently
I
in,
was
so.
going to
And
suggest.
I was until last year.
Okay.
So I've been for a long time for Legacy.
As long as there's somebody in this group that also knows ASCLD, I don't think it makes sense to just have an ABFT person compare. I think you need both.
Yeah, but
I
Legacy
agree.
is markedly different from international.
I
You
agree.
were Legacy or international?
We were Legacy. And I think the international changes should be included. I agree that they
All of
should
them
be.
would be very helpful.
I agree.
And I, for one, need to know what the ABFT will look like after the SWIG recommendations. If the ABFT is updated, what that will do for the ABFT as well.
And I, just for the record, I'm still puzzled by our colleague's answer before, when they were criticizing him for not specifically having in his SOP what the validation was, and was it in writing that it was validated. I'm still confused. Answers that people give to the questions from these meetings have to be precise, because, I think one of the things that we learned a long time ago, somebody once told us about these lab validations or any of these reports, if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And so I'm just concerned about making sure that the validation, as we understand it, is in writing, and it's a validation with respect to how you interpret the results from the assays, and it's all very clear.
Could I make one other comment with that recommendation? SWIG talks and the validation method says that you must have in writing everything you're going to do, what your plan is, what your changes are. So once that gets changed with ABFT, and again, it should be out for public comment soon, I think you'll see definitely a change.
Thank you. All right, the next item we have on relates to Monroe County, and before we deal with the substance of it, there's a procedural comment I wanted to make. Presently, there's mandatory reporting requirements to the Office of Forensic Services regarding matters of significant changes relevant to accreditation, and specifically relating to notification regarding changes to the organization, top management, and key personnel of the laboratory. And those requirements require notice within 30 days to ASCLD Lab. At least for me personally, the Monroe County situation we're dealing with now calls into question whether or not a 30-day notice is really appropriate when we have significant changes. For example, the replacement of a lab director. And I question whether or not we should really be waiting 30 days to get that notice, or whether we should have a requirement that maybe it's 3 days or 5 days. Because frankly, we're reading about changes in the newspaper rather than getting notice as they're happening. So, I throw that out there. If other members of the commission share that concern, if someone wants to make a motion in that regard, I'd certainly entertain it.
I make a motion that the notice be 3 days in cases of changes in laboratory personnel comporting with the current regulations.
Right, and I believe the language right now relates to organization, top management, and key personnel. But is there a second to just change the time requirement from 30 days to 3 days?
Can we make it 3 business days?
Sure,
so
3 business days is fine.
I second the motion.
Any discussion on that?
And is that a motion to change our regulation to require that notification?
Yes.
All right, we've got a motion, we've got a second. All in favor? Anyone opposed? As to the substance regarding the Monroe County issuing the Inspector General's report, I indicated, I think in our last meeting, and I'll state it again, part of the allegations relate to the operation of the lab during the time I was district attorney in Monroe County. The district attorney's office is mentioned in the report. And I think it's appropriate that I recuse myself from all of the proceedings, because of the interaction I had with the lab as district attorney. I don't want anything, I don't want my participation to in any way affect either the substance of what this commission does or create the appearance that it affected anything the commission did. So I'm going to recuse myself from anything with regard to this issue, and I believe that leaves Gina as our chair for this part of the meeting.
Okay, before we start the discussion of this matter, Janet Anderson, Sequest attorney, has called us and requested that she be permitted to speak. So if no one has objection to that, we'll have her call in. Are there any objections to that? Okay. Okay, and then before we start the discussion, I'd like to ask the Inspector General and the representatives from Monroe County to join us at the table.
Running out of chairs.
So I'd like to open the floor to the Inspector General if she'd like to make any comments.
Well, the report is public. It was sent to all the commissioners. I think the report speaks for itself. Prior to the issuance of the report, it was requested of Monroe County that we gave them a copy of the report so they could make a comment and take whatever corrective action that they deem appropriate. We've included in some of the substance their corrective action. I'm sure they're here today to discuss that with the commissioners. Certainly, if any of the commissioners have questions of me regarding the investigations, I'm open to those questions.
I'll open the floor for discussion.
Will we hear from Ms. Anderson?
She's going to call in.
Oh, okay.
So do you want to wait for that, or do you
No,
want to?
no. I know she's going to call. For me?
Well, I'm just curious as to what it is that we're being asked to consider right now. I mean, I read the report. I think it's pretty thorough. It's pretty damning, and I understand Monroe County has taken action regarding this. What are we considering right now?
there's whatever questions you have for the county. Do you have any additional questions for the county?
Oh, okay.
I have a question for anybody. You said Monroe County gave a formal answer. Do we have their formal answer before us?
Well, it's in the back of the report. There's a response from the
No. What's in the back of the report is the Inspector General's interpretation or summary of the response.
That's correct.
And so my question is, was there a formal written response that you received?
There was.
And if so, can we get that?
Certainly, I can
Oh,
provide that.
yeah, and one of the reasons, okay, is one of the major quality issues that your report persuasively calls attention to is the failure to have any standards in place or protocol in place with respect to what triggers an audit of all cases and the scope of the audit when it is triggered. And one of the things that you say in the summary of their response, which I found very intriguing on page 32, is that they did intend to propose a policy amendment which would require an audit as part of every corrective action plan involving an analytical error. And then two, it provides guidance as to the scope of the audit. And the reason that's an issue particularly germane to this commission is that I believe, and I may be mistaken, that none of the laboratories that we regulate have a written protocol with respect to if not when an audit is triggered, certainly the scope of that audit. And even though you acknowledge in your report that every situation is unique, you would expect to see guidelines, in existence, so people know exactly what the kind of parameters are that they're dealing with. And frankly, I would also suggest that this group, the commission, take up as a suggestion, if you will, of this Inspector General's report, the need for a statewide guideline for all the laboratories that we regulate on when an audit is triggered and the scope of the audit. Because there are criticisms of Monroe County here, but we would be remiss if we didn't acknowledge that there's a dearth of information on those same topics at the other laboratories that we regulate. So it's a system problem.
I appreciate those comments, and one of the things that we found during the course of our investigation was that Monroe County was remiss relative to those types of issues, protocols and guidelines needed for an audit. They provided with specificity to my office in response to this report proposed guidelines, which I assume that they are here to discuss with the commissioners, outlining with, again, particularity as to what they're recommending. As to whether you want to apply that statewide to your other labs, I leave that for the commissioners for discussion, but certainly I would defer to Monroe County to discuss with specificity their new guidelines that they're going to be proposing.
Page 22 of the report, I found this a bit confusing. The last paragraph. Anderson Sequest reported to the IG that prior to issuing the no analysis reports, because the statute of limitations had passed, she had advised local law enforcement agencies of the Monroe County Laboratories plan at meetings of Law Enforcement Council, which includes chiefs of police, DA, other law enforcement representatives from the area. I read that to mean that before she issued these letters and returned evidence, that in fact proper channels were taken to announce the plan, but that no one at that time preempted that plan.
From our investigation, we had learned that there was a special meeting of the Law Enforcement Council. At that meeting, there was a very generic statement made
that evidence is going to be returned to law enforcement relative to the issue of the statute of limitations being, that it had passed.
So Janet's notice to the law enforcement council didn't prompt any discussion?
Not as far as we discern from our investigation. Mr. Judge.
I have a few questions for the Inspector General and for Monroe County, and either one can answer or both. First, the Inspector General's report regarding these incidents, has that been sent to ASCLD Lab? Has anybody sent it to ASCLD Lab? Has Monroe County sent it to them, or the IG? And the reason I asked for that, simply, you have not. Has Monroe County?
Monroe County has not.
Okay, I just remind the commission of the last appearance of Mr. Keaton and Mr. Jarvis, was it, who came up and presented to us, and in response to Mr. Scheck's question, that had you read the 2008 report by Inspector General Fish regarding the Veters incident, that they indicated they had not read that report at all. So one thing that, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to state that I did send that link to the report to Bud Keaton.
Okay, so
they're aware.
So they're aware of it. So my own preference, and this is for the commission to decide, and I'll make a motion if it's necessary unless there's widespread opposition, is that there ought to be a formal letter sent from the commission to ASCLD Lab with respect to the report from the IG and asking for them to comment on that report in terms of their accreditation process over the last 5 years with respect to Monroe County, or at least for the period beginning in March of 2010 when the analysis was done by the forensic biologist in the particular unit that the IG concentrated on. That's one request. Now, have you spoken to ASCLD Lab, Monroe County, since all of this started?
If I could just do some introductions, I think that may make things easier. My name is Dan DeLoss. I'm Deputy County Executive. To my left, Steve Bowman, our Director of Public Safety. To his left, the Acting Director, John Clark, and I'll defer to Mr. Clark for that answer.
A letter was sent from Monroe County to ASCLD Lab, to Mr. Keaton, addressed to Mr. Keaton.
I read the letter. It's pretty pro forma, if I may say so. It just says we've had an incident up here. We've replaced the lab director. My question is a little bit more in depth than that. Have you gotten on the phone as the public safety person and said to ASCLD Lab, we have a big problem here. This is what occurred. We just got a report from the state IG. And have you had that discussion? Has ASCLD Lab, for example, indicated to you, we need to come up to New York and take a look at your laboratory?
During the initial stages of the investigation, I believe the county received I don't know what you would call it, a preliminary report. And during that process of going through that report, in the early stages, Mr. Keaton reached out to me, spoke to me on the phone, but it was my understanding after consulting with the county attorney that I was not to release that report to Mr. Keaton, and Mr. Keaton should seek that report through the Inspector General's office.
Did Mr. Keaton speak to the Inspector General and seek that report?
No.
Okay. Is there anything, as the public safety director, whatever position you all have now, is there anything in the ASCLD Lab rules and regulations, as you currently read them, that required you to have an audit and the scope of the audit that Mr. Neufeld was referring to and which the IG refers to, that did not exist in this case, and include in your answer whether or not there's anything that you know of in the ASCLD Lab rules and regulations that would have required Ms. Ascroft, am I pronouncing that correctly?
Yes.
To have retained those lists that she no longer has with respect to what she was finding?
I don't believe there is anything that specific that states that you should retain those documents from the office.
So you had no real direction with respect to that from the ASCLD Lab accreditation process?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Let me ask you this. As we sit here today, we know from the IG's report what Ms. Anderson Sequist did. What is the status currently of Ms. Ascroft? And what is the status of Ms., and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, Calhoun?
Calhoun.
Calhoun. Oh, it was an error, okay. Calhoun. Can you please tell me where are they right now? Are they on the payroll? Are they engaged in what they should be doing? They're satisfied with what they're doing?
The answer to both is yes, they both are.
Okay. And there's no review process underway with respect to them?
Not present.
Okay. I suppose the next question is to the deputy county executive as well as to the lab personnel. What do you think happened here where a lab director of a major lab in the state of New York came before the public commission that is in charge of accreditation and general lab issues, that she would say, given the circumstances that led up to this incident, where everything was done right. Am I correct? Everything was done right initially. The biologist made a mistake. They found it. They retrained her. They put her back on the payroll slowly and checked her next 5 cases. It was only at the end, when this audit was done, that the problems began to surface. And so my question is, what was it that Anderson Sequist did not understand in Mr. Fitzpatrick's question? And what words are we to take away? I read the report. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we're dealing with 4 words: rechecked, reanalyzed, retested, and reviewed. And all those words, which Mr. Fitzpatrick thought he knew what he was talking about, I think the lawyers who were on the commission thought we knew what he was talking about. It appears from the IG's very specific questioning that the IG knew what Mr. Fitzpatrick was talking about. What happened here? In your lab, do you think when you come before the commission and we ask you a simple question, which we trust that you understand, that we don't get it? Or is this a word gamesmanship thing? I just don't understand what happened here.
Well, if I could take a first
Sure.
crack at that, I don't think that anybody sitting here at this table representing Monroe County can answer what Janet Anderson Sequist was thinking when she made that answer. We couldn't have answered it then, and we can't now, to be honest with you. But I can certainly understand somebody on this commission asking that question. It's a reasonable question to ask.
Right.
I can tell you it's been discussed, and everyone here would agree that we need to make sure in the future when we're answering questions that obviously we're answering everything truthfully, fully, and if there's any doubt as to the meaning of the question or terms being used, the best thing to do is to ask for clarification, and that will happen.
Is there anybody else who wants to comment on that? No? I mean, the Inspector General's report, correct me if I'm wrong, because you were very careful in what you said about Ms. Anderson Sequist, that her information that she gave to the commission was inaccurate. You didn't accuse her of perjury or lying or anything of that nature, and you didn't give a reason why you think the event occurred, why she did these things. And I don't think that's your place to do that, quite frankly. I think that's here in the commission that we're trying to figure that out. It seems to me, and I'd like to hear from the director and people who are personnel in the lab, that what happened here was that Ms. Ascroft partly got it right and partly screwed up. And that in September of 2010, when the lab director came before this commission, she either was protecting Ascroft and didn't want the commission to figure out what Ascroft had done, because at that point we didn't know that the list had been destroyed, or she just deliberately felt, and this is the real issue for me, she just deliberately felt that she did not have to answer to the commission. Now, I don't know what the culture is in the Monroe County lab, but one of the things I'm concerned about as I've sat on the commission is we continually hear that the labs are all fine and good. I see in the audience today is Bob Adamo, runs a great lab. He's the first person to respond, I don't do that in my lab. The OCME's office often says at these meetings, we don't do that in our lab. And yet here we sit today. This is the third IG report that we've had. One in 2008, one in 2011 on Nassau County, and now this one. So my question to you is, I agree with the deputy county executive that what we should be having is complete, full disclosure, honesty, and in the spirit of what we're trying to do here. What's going on in Monroe County that led to this?
I can't answer what Janet was thinking when she answered the questions to this commission. Obviously, I wasn't here.
Right.
I wasn't part of that Inspector General's investigation, so I really can't answer questions regarding that. What I can tell you is that we have an excellent team of scientists at the crime laboratory currently, and an excellent quality system in place, which we will seek to improve upon after reviewing the IG's report and looking at their recommendations.
How long, sir, have you been in the laboratory business?
I've been a firearms examiner with Monroe County for 14 years.
In your 14 years involved in that field and in the laboratory arena, have you ever heard of an incident, ever, anywhere in the United States, where a lab director took it upon herself to make a determination about one of the most complex rules in American law, and certainly in New York law, the statute of limitations and speedy trial? Have you ever heard of that?
No.
Do you think, and this is a question I ask because I'm going to propose some things in a minute, do you think it would be a good idea for the commission to recommend that in all laboratories across this state under the jurisdiction of this commission, that there be a legal education program consisting of 2 hours of legal education a year by lawyers for the prosecution and the defense to address the technicians on issues such as the statute of limitations, very interesting other legal concept, Brady versus Maryland. Do you think this would help you at all?
I think it would be a very good idea, but I still don't think those legal determinations have a place in the technical reports.
But it would help technicians in their daily routine, for example, in not destroying records, right?
Yes.
I mean, we've encountered this before with ASCLD Lab in San Francisco, where there was a DNA mix-up, and the records were destroyed. And ASCLD Lab came in a few months later, discovered that problem, discovered it had been lied to about that problem, and reaccredited the agency. And it just seems to me that this problem of records keeping, which I can understand, in the busyness of a lab, you may or may not do something, but it seems to me that the product of the lab is for the court system. That's why we call this forensic, right? If this was just science, and you were just giving this to Rockefeller University, we'd have a whole different set of rules. But since it's forensic science, and the product is coming into the court system, it certainly would behoove everybody to understand in the labs that you can't destroy documents under any circumstances. We don't allow that for people on Wall Street to destroy emails. They go to jail for doing that. And certainly, it seemed to me this is a basic legal education problem. And I did want to ask the Inspector General at the same time, I want to hear a comment from both. You suggest that there be some interplay between the Monroe County lab and legal law enforcement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Would I be incorrect if I asked the commission to consider a motion that says across the state, the labs have to establish a legal liaison officer, if we can get the funding for it? Because I know in the commission, whenever you raise something, the first argument is there's no money to do that. But money is an aspirational issue. Would it be a good idea to have a legal information officer in the labs? I know, for example, in the last couple of months, I've had a number of legal questions, and I've called the OCME. And they do a really good job over the phone answering legal questions. And by the way, saves everybody a lot of time, including the court system and unnecessary motions. You're a lawyer. What do you think? Do you think that would be a good idea?
I think it is a good idea. I think that we're starting to see those types of issues more and more as we're proceeding with allegations and complaints and when we're conducting investigations.
Right. And when you say that, you would include in it this issue of document destruction.
Clearly.
Clearly, right? Because as lawyers who work in a court of law and you're trying a robbery case and there's latent prints and you want to know where's the information, and somebody says, well, we don't keep that information, or we destroy that information, that's problematical in a court of law. It can lead not only to a wrongful conviction, but it could lead to a wrongful acquittal, correct? I mean, both ways. Let me ask you this, Ms. I apologize.
Lady Scott.
Leahy Scott. Let me ask you this. Earlier in the meeting, Mr. Neufeld spent a lot of time with the Nassau County latent print people. And I think one of the things he was driving at is that there's this area in the labs where they believe, and maybe correctly so, that the way they do things is fine scientifically. So they want to give to the latent print examiner, and it could be any other discipline, it could be in tool marks as well, or arson investigation, the ability to have this discretion not to note things. But we know as lawyers, receiving a forensic product in a court of law, that is a huge problem, right? It's a huge problem first for the district attorney, because the district attorney is interviewing the witness and says, whoa, where did that come from? I don't see that anywhere. And the defense attorney hires an expert, and the expert looks at the material, doesn't see what's written down, and then we get to trial, and suddenly the expert for the prosecution avers under oath for the first time, I did see that, but I didn't note it back then. Isn't this problematical for us as a commission, that we ought to be addressing these omissions that the labs consider okay for them, which they may be right scientifically, but it's not okay for the court system?
I think if you're asking the Inspector General relative to that which is pertinent to the criminal justice system,
yes,
you will always hear from us that we want to hear about annotation, documentation, and complete transparency. You're probably going to see that in every report that we give.
Right. The reason I'm asking you is because I don't want the commissioners to think that when I make the motion that this is something I do, because I have Jim here might just fall off the chair.
I'm glad you clarified.
I want you, the Inspector General, to say that. And so you have, and it's an obvious question, and I apologize for it, but it was necessary for the record. I know I've taken up a lot of time as a commissioner. May I ask just one or two more things? Is it possible for the commissioners to get, going back to the year 2009 to the present, all of the ASCLD lab 5-year accreditations, interim accreditations, et cetera? Is it possible to send a letter from this commission?
You mean from Monroe County?
Yeah, from Monroe County. And is it possible to send a letter from this commission to ASCLD Lab, to Mr. Keaton, asking them to provide us with the underlying documents of the accreditation test that they did, the accreditation audits, so that we could see those? Because I know they told Mr. Scheck when they appeared here that although they had destroyed the records from the Veters incident, they had since changed their ways, and they were now keeping that information. Would that be a terrible imposition for us? We can request that. I would respectfully ask that we do that so the commission has more information in front of it. And the last thing I want to ask is this, and then I apologize to my fellow commissioners. This is to the IG as well as to the personnel and to the Deputy County Executive. Do you think that this commission would be way out of line, remiss, or well in line if we said to you today that you come back here in 6 months with a full report to us, what's going on in your lab across the board? Because I'm nervous. Having lived through Nassau County, and having just gone, now we have a lab director who went off the rail, that you need to do a top-to-bottom review of everything in that lab. And I grew up in Nassau County, so I understand county executives and deputy county executives. It would seem to me, if I were a public official, I'd want to know every single thing I could know about that laboratory. So my question to you is, do you think, both the county and to the lab people and to the IG, that it would be a proper thing for this commission today to vote that we need to see you in 6 months, we want a full report that you've done a complete review of everything, not just what the IG is recommending, because I think those are all important recommendations, but everything you do, every forensic discipline, so we find out what's going on. You might find out things you don't know. After all, and this seems to me fairly obvious, if this was a lower level official, I think my request would be way out of line. But this isn't the lower level official. This is the person who set the tone at the top. And we don't know, since you, and I've asked you several times and you've been honest, I believe you don't know the answers as to why she did what she did. So since you don't know, and I don't know, and the commission doesn't know, maybe what we ought to do is have a full-blown review of the lab. Or alternatively, we could ask Askeladd Lab. We have that right under 995A. That's the statute. We have the right to ask Askeladd Lab to come up here and do a full-blown review. We don't have to wait for another year. We don't have to wait for a 5-year. We could say to them now, come up here, do a full review. We want to know what's going on.
The problem, I think, with the second alternative is the way I read the IG's report, Marvin, is if I look at the very first sentence, it says that the IG identified significant failures in the management of the laboratory. And I think, there's nothing in the Askeladd Lab requirements that really goes to the heart of the problems that were identified by the Inspector General. Now, that may very well be a deficiency in Askeladd Lab's accreditation program, but we don't answer that problem by having them go back and do what they don't ordinarily do. I think if the IG has identified a significant problem in management, I think you're right, it would be incumbent on the county to do some kind of review, to think about maybe they need better systems in place, whatever they need to prevent this kind of failure of management. Okay?
So let me just ask you, Mr. County Executive, Deputy County Executive, and the lab people, rather than me make a motion requiring you to do a full-blown review top to bottom, would you consent to do that and come back here in 6 months and tell us what you found?
Without absolutely knowing what you mean by full-blown review.
I mean everything. Every forensic discipline you're doing in that lab, who's in charge, do you have audits in ballistics, whatever you do, we'd like you to go through the lab, top to bottom, and see what's going on.
Well, I'm sorry.
Or to maybe Peter's question, at least a report on the management.
Yeah.
Well, because what management really is about, among other things, is supervision and oversight, and checks and balances and all that kind of stuff. And what the IG is identifying here is a failure of management, which means that there's a failure of oversight. And so your response that was summarized by the IG doesn't deal with this sort of overarching problem of a failure of oversight, if you will, within the laboratory. So it would be very good for you to come back and sort of address that issue. One of the things we're trying to get at is this is like a learning moment, okay? And the IG is sort of doing us all a favor by calling our attention to these kinds of problems, not in terms of finger pointing. Forget that; those are separate issues. But she's noticed some systemic issues here in the laboratory that need to be addressed. And rather than finger pointing, but look at this as an opportunity for the laboratory to strengthen and improve, what it's got going for it. And it would be good for us to hear how you go about that process.
I would say that we expected something like this and we welcome it. Absolutely, we'll do whatever we need. One of the the items in our remedial plan is to form an advisory board locally, consisting of representatives from law enforcement, from the district attorney's office, and from the defense bar to help us with this. And we'll absolutely do that. We'll come back whenever you want us to come back.
I just want to ask you a question about that. I was looking at the law advisory concept. I didn't see the defense bar mentioned in it originally.
It's going to be there.
But they're going to be there.
Absolutely.
Because they may have something that could help you from their point of view.
They will be there.
And I know, by the way, just for the record, your lab is one of the better labs in the state that has become much more transparent over the last 5 years. Under interestingly enough, Ms. Anderson Sequist. Am I right? You changed,
Yes.
you changed a lot of your procedures.
Yes.
I know because I've spoken to the defense attorneys up there. They give you high marks.
I have a couple of questions. I assume that you're in the process now of searching for a new director?
Well, we have begun discussions in that regard, of course, yes. But we figured let's deal with this today and then move right on to it, yes.
And I just have, is it John?
Yes. Yes, sir.
Was it common knowledge in the lab that she was making legal decisions regarding statute of limitations and destroying evidence?
Well, the laboratory itself did not destroy the evidence. As for the reports that contain the quote about the statute of limitations, I'm sure other analysts saw that report because they had to go through a technical review process. But from my point of view, I was in a different section and I didn't see those reports or were aware that they had gone out.
And I noticed that one thing the Inspector General's report mentions is a backlog regarding DNA cases, and I'm wondering if there's any plan to eliminate that backlog, perhaps hiring more personnel or reassessing how you do it. Not that my way is the best way, but I have a very close relationship with my laboratory director in terms of communication. We don't, if a case is going to plead out, we don't have them do the DNA analysis or a full-blown analysis, other types of forensic analysis. I'm wondering if you have that type of communication with Sandra Dorley and if you're making some efforts to address the backlog.
Do you mind, John, just for a brief second? I do want you to know, Mr. Fitzpatrick, that one of the things that we did in preparing our responses to speak with Sandra Dorley, because that's very important, especially because her office was mentioned very much and involved with the incidents which are the subject of the report. So we did that and we received her feedback on that. It was all favorable, by the way.
She's a lot easier to deal with than her predecessor.
I have a question, actually.
I'm sorry, I don't know if you wanted, John, to further answer your
Yeah,
question or not.
just that some efforts are being made to address the backlog, either hiring new personnel or better approach to how the evidence is analyzed.
I could address
Please,
this, sir.
thank you.
Since February 2009, where we were at 994 cases in our backlog, today we are at 487, and we have 13 biology positions in the lab. 4 of those are people that will be coming out of training anytime soon, and they will be able to then assume casework as appropriate. So I believe we're about a year and a half out to be down to where we need to be, and that is 30-day turnaround.
Does that decrease include the cases that were sent back?
Yes, it does.
So it's not that significant a decrease then, really?
Some of those 200, I think it was 270 cases that were sent back, were sent, I should clarify that, were sent back from the lab to the agencies, were then, not all of them, some of them were sent back for reanalysis or to be analyzed. So they weren't analyzed the first time. I'm not sure how many that was.
It was 40.
I think it was
41.
41.
It was 41 identified by the district attorney's office.
And when you say backlog, you mean that you're now referring to cases that are coming in from police or law enforcement for you to do an analysis on, and if you haven't done it within 30 days, then it's characterized as a backlog case.
As soon as a case comes in the door, it's counted.
Right.
No matter how many days it's been there. towards the back, whether it's a day old or 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah, my statement of 30 days was in response to Mr. Fitzpatrick, who asked, and that is our goal, to be able to get to and deal with backlog so that we, in the future, can turn cases around in 30 days. That's
So
our goal.
what is your turnaround time now?
I don't know that number right now.
I mean, is that a number that you ever calculate?
I don't know that we have. It's obviously higher than we want it to be. But one of the things that we have done in the past and that we will do in the future is prioritize when the agency which brings the evidence asks for such prioritization.
Because I remember that when Sean was giving testimony about DNA expansion, Sean Burns, you know, questions were asked of him, and then I know I personally followed up and asked him, what is the turnaround time? And I think that this is an extremely important concept to get straight and to get a real number on. And by that I mean, you know, if you have a murder, rape, serious felony assault where there is biological evidence that you have to test with DNA, then I think labs should know we are turning that around in X number of days. And just to give you the standard, it's been found consistently, and the best data is from the United Kingdom, and we had this data when we started this commission and set up the DNA subcommittee. You have to do those within 7 to 10 days, and then you really clear crimes. And we should know what the turnaround time is on that, and the turnaround time is on other cases, because until we know what the turnaround time is on these new cases coming in, I don't really understand all this testimony about what the backlog is. Because, you know, I mean, well, we don't have a backlog, or our backlog isn't a serious problem, or our backlog is reasonable. Those are all meaningless answers unless I know what your turnaround time is. And no insult to Sean, he just couldn't give me these answers. And those were relevant questions, I think, when you're considering whether to expand the DNA. We did that, that's fine. But we need to know those, and it might be useful if you could calculate them.
As reported to us, we do a laboratory workload survey. As reported to us in March of 2012, their turnaround time in biology was 947 days.
So, turnaround time.
However, that could include some old cold cases or whatever.
Right. Well, what does that mean? I mean, 947 days.
We had 270 cases here that were more than 5 years.
Right. I mean, that's not. I'm just saying that is not a very helpful diagnostic number to have on the efficiency of the lab or the criminal justice system. That can't be acceptable. You know, you wouldn't want my herb. I mean.
So are there staffing issues at the lab? I noticed in ABFT's review of Monroe Talks, they said, you know, the lab was of outstanding quality, but they had issues with turnaround time due to freezes and staffing.
I would say it's fair to say that each and every year the county struggles with its budget. And part of budget, we all know, is staffing. We do our best to balance the need for staffing with the need to protect taxpayers. I mean, we've all heard that time and time again, but it's reality. So certainly something like this will cause us to take an even harder look at our lab, and we're in the midst of our budget preparation now.
I just have a question. Maybe this is for you, John. Were the other 2 cases in question ever rechecked?
Yes, they were, and they were negative.
Also, can you tell us what is you have applied to ASCI Lab for increasing scope to bring on digital evidence to your laboratory. In light of recent events, can you tell us where you are with that now? Is that going to be on hold?
We haven't decided it's going to be on hold yet. I have to discuss that with the quality assurance coordinator. But currently, they are doing their mock cases in that area.
And then I just have another, just something to bring to the commission. During
There has been quite a number of changes in your QA manager, people holding your QA manager position in your laboratory. In fact, from spring of 2009 to 2011, it bounced back to 5 different people during that time. And this certainly is a concern because we saw the same situation occur in Nassau FEB lab. Do you have any, I know that maybe you don't, but maybe this is for Steve Bowman, were you aware of any problems or why their QA position could not be maintained by one person?
I really don't. I don't have an answer to that.
In one actually 12-month period, it was 3 different people who were handling it, and this is certainly something that...
That's one of the areas I'm going to look at very closely.
Just a very threshold question, which I don't know the answer to, which is mentioned in the IG's report, that which triggered this whole thing. In the old days, laboratories had different protocols for how they would actually analyze a slide to decide whether or not sperm were present or not. Do you know if is there a national DNA standard now on how laboratories are to go about that microscopic analysis of slides for the presence or absence of sperm? Or does it vary from lab to lab?
Not being a DNA analyst, I cannot answer that question.
I mean, I know it's out of turn. Do you know whether or not that's true? Is there a national standard?
There are no national standards for serology like this.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, because one of the things, just to educate this commission a little bit, one lab, I mean, it's possible that one could actually examine an entire slide, but it used to be, I don't know what the reality is now, generally that's not done. Generally now, what used to happen is that an analyst would simply look at certain random areas, a sampling of the slide for the presence of sperm. Because it was a very time-consuming thing to look at an entire slide when you're looking at it under a microscope, because each area looks so big, okay? And it just might be worth it if we knew more about that, because then you'd have a better understanding about what went wrong here in the first place.
Has Ms. Seacrest joined us by phone? Hello?
I did see that a number came up on the big screen, 585.
Oh, really?
A while ago.
I'd like to go back to page 22. I'd like to relate how I reacted when I read that text. I read that to mean that Janet had in fact presented her plans to the Law Enforcement Council, and that her upline, upper management, DA, that they were remiss in not preempting her plan. Now, you do go on to say that the minutes didn't reflect any such discussion regarding statute of limitations. Did anyone at the meeting, did you interview and ask that question? Did anyone at the meeting recall a discussion of statute of limitations?
No, our understanding from the investigation was that it was just a general, perfunctory statement that we will be returning some evidence because of the statute of limitations.
And that's everyone's recollection of the extent of discussion. One last question. Who is Janet's supervisors? Did he or she, he or she aware of the plan?
I'm her supervisor.
Oh.
And in terms of her plan, I knew she was going to return evidence. What I didn't know is the statement, the legal statement that was made in the report that eventually went out.
What was your understanding of why she was going to return the evidence?
We were in the process of moving the lab. They were working on backlogs.
She said it would be easier to get rid of the evidence to make the move easier.
Because there were many cases that went back many years. I would like to point out in the report, in the letter that I sent as a response, there are 3 protocol changes. You're going to see QM16, EH2 and AD1 that we're recommending changing in the lab, that will address each and every one of these recommendations that the IG's report cite.
Yes.
There's a little confusion up front here. I was just asking some people whether or not it was clear to you what I was asking you to do. You're agreeing that 6 months from now, you'll come back here with a full written report, an overview of what you found. I wouldn't want you to come back here and say, we reviewed, we rechecked. Do you have any questions? You're going to be forward and progressive and come back with specific statements. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's fair, and I think that we would enlist the help of DCJS, if you would, in the IG, or whatever is appropriate. I think we're all on the same page as what we want to have happen.
Okay, great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Is Janet Anderson Sequest on the phone? Okay. Lou, do you want to check on that and see if it's supposed to be was?
Hello?
That would be Janet.
Hello?
Can you hear us?
Hi, this is Janet. Can you hear me?
Yes,
I can just barely hear you. I haven't heard everything.
Would you like to make a statement?
Can't hear you.
She can't hear. Janet, this is...
I'm sorry, I haven't heard. Can you hear me? I can barely hear you.
Janet, this is Gina Bianchi. Would you like to...
Hello?
Hello, Janet?
Kathy, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Janet.
Kathy, okay, because I'm speaking from a car, so I don't know if you can hear me or not. I apologize that I did not hear the entire proceedings, but I followed all the policies and procedures of the laboratory. There was nothing that was violated. I spoke with the lab routinely, even after I was on admin leave, to assist in making the response. And it's an outstanding laboratory.
Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Sequest?
Janet, I do have a question. This is Kathy Levine. When you returned the evidence, why did you believe that the evidence might be more secure in the law enforcement agencies and not in the laboratory? Because I believe there had been maybe past history where some of the agencies have lost evidence. Why would you want to return evidence to them?
I discussed with other lab directors across the country that had moved into laboratory facilities as to recommendations on the best way to handle phases of the move. And since the move itself, the physical move, is a huge impact on the organization and the evidence, they have recommended sending older evidence back to safeguard it.
Excuse me, Janet, this is Kathy Corrado. Did you not have enough room? I know you just built a beautiful new laboratory. Would you not have provisions in the laboratory to be able to retain that evidence, and would it not be secure if it were still in the if it were moved to the secure area of the new laboratory?
Just that whatever evidence was not picked up, we moved. We did move evidence.
Does anyone have anything else? Okay, thank you, Janet. Does anyone have anything else for the county?
I do.
Yes.
I have just a question for Ms. Leigh Scott. In light of the fact that at the end of your report, many of the recommendations deal with the auditing process. And I know that in analogous situations, the Inspector General of the United States Department of Justice will make systemic recommendations to the Department of Justice, and then we'll work with them to see them implement some of those suggested reforms. Since this criticism you have of Monroe County is not limited to Monroe County, but the reality is that other laboratories also lack guidelines for triggering an audit, and more importantly, for the scope of the audit, the duration of the audit, all those related issues. Would the Inspector General's office be willing to work with members of this commission to try and come up with a statewide guideline on the auditing function?
We can certainly assist based upon the investigations that we've conducted, absolutely.
Okay, but you know, to a certain extent, we also, as individual members, lack an expertise in what those guidelines should look like, and we would have to go to outside experts to get input to make those recommendations, or to at least mandate them for all the laboratories in the state. Can the IG help to provide us with some of that expertise?
That's why I had that limitation, is that I can only provide the expertise based upon the investigations that we've conducted in our office. So, but certainly we can assist in whatever we could possibly do. So, we're providing that expertise.
Can I make one more statement?
Sure, go ahead.
Again, I haven't heard everything, but
We can't hear you.
You're breaking up.
Janet, we can't hear you. We only hear
Yeah.
the third word. You're breaking up.
that at no time did I lie or intentionally misrepresent anything during the investigation.
Is that it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a request then to Gina that I don't know. I mean, almost Richard, you could weigh in on this. Whether it should be like a subcommittee or some group within us that could work with the Inspector General to try and develop a statewide guideline that then could be shared with all the different laboratories when these errors arise, so they could have a sense of what would be a scientifically appropriate yet practical audit. Does that make any sense?
Or interested members of the commission or the office. Once again, I agree with you. It's an important initiative. And the IG certainly in its several reports now has enlightened this commission on the weaknesses in lab practices and our oversight. So yes, any opportunity to work with the IG to the extent that they wish to do so.
We can just cover the audit and the scope of the audit and when there should be an audit. We can cover some of these other issues as well.
Well, no, there are other issues. There's a quality assurance committee that was already set up with Richard, but I'm talking about very specifically now to deal with the audit, okay, and to work with the IG on that. We could work with them on other things some other time, but this is something that comes out of this report repeatedly, and it's a good place to start, just like, you know, we're going to start next time with a discussion about the FBI protocols on fingerprints and whether we want to impose that, you know, statewide or whatever. So what I would like to do is agree right now that I mean, for instance, you know, Kathy would be a great member to work on that as well, because as a lab director, she has to decide what should be the scope of any audit if it comes up. So she'll be great on practical issues. In the past, we've been briefed by, for instance, the NYPD when they conducted retrospective audits, and they would love advice on how far-reaching or how narrow they should be. It's something that we should do. That's all.
And I should say the NYPD audits were unbelievably thorough. I mean, just in terms of how comprehensive they were. And these things cost money, too.
So I would like us to now move forward and make that happen and have people volunteer from this commission and from the Division of Criminal Justice Services to informally begin the process of working with the Inspector General on coming up with guidelines that we can then distribute to all the laboratories that we regulate.
Well, this commission has yet to address the OIG recommendations, and I would like to think that what you're calling for now would fall out from the commission's action, the reaction to the OIG report. So
To this report or to the NASA report? I'm just curious.
To the FED,
Okay.
OIG FED.
Okay.
I mean, we do have proposals on the
Right.
for next steps.
And finally, I don't know how much more we're going to be discussing this particular issue, but Marvin raised something before about what we can learn from this in terms of the interrelationship between the legal rules that govern both the system and the labs. And one of the things that I think we can draw out of this, and from our experience in a number of these investigations, and is there, I think there are certain principles that about which there's a consensus, and emerged actually at the ABA forensic meeting 2 weeks ago Friday when Jill Spriggs testified, who I guess is the head of Askeladd Lab now, right? Certainly the director in California. And that was that in terms of the issue of Brady material, right, or the issue of, preserving evidence or statute of limitations, these legal rules, I think that there's actually a consensus now that in the best position for a lab to take is that they preserve everything and disclose, however you want to write the reports, but everything is disclosed to the prosecutor, right? Because if that complete disclosure is made of all the underlying data and reports, that's there, and the lab has fulfilled its obligations with respect to the disclosure of exculpatory evidence. And by the way, I should note, labs who do not do that, or have a custom pattern or practice of not doing that in any particular case, can be sued, and you should all be insured. All right, labs have been sued for failure to comply with that obligation. It's clearly established under the Constitution of this country that the police and laboratories have an obligation to disclose the exculpatory evidence to the prosecutors. So if you want to not have that problem, just give them everything, right? Number two, whenever there is a serious or material error, right, whether it's deliberate or it's failure to do a control or any of the things that we see, all the time in the course of these things, there's a duty to correct that, first of all, is ethical and is part of the rules governing all the different entities that regulate. There is a duty to correct, and once the correction is made known, it should be made known, of course, to the legal officer in charge, the district attorney's office. But what the FBI now acknowledges itself in the way they've been dealing with these issues, and I think is clear from the way all these things have come out through the commission and through the IG's report, is that the district attorney should be known, the court should be notified, and some, depending on the age of the case, some mechanism be put in place through law enforcement councils, whatever, for the defense bar to be notified too. And so I think that there is some consensus on doing that, and it might be useful for us pursuing the suggestion that Marvin made, and maybe those of us who've been dealing with this in the commission, to kind of lay out these rules, along with designating people to be the legal liaisons between the labs or councils or whatever. That, we really can do that in a way that I think would move things forward, because we've put in place already and know how difficult it's been when we have some of these errors. Then we have to go back and look at the old cases, and that's a hard thing to do. So I think that we're really in a pretty good position now to begin to develop some, clear guidelines and policies that would assist everybody in these things. And I thought that was a big suggestion.
If I may, I would like to note that we have developed protocols about audits in the future, proposed protocol changes, and we can give them to whatever member of the commission, anyone that would like that. Frankly, I thought that they had been distributed, so I apologize if they hadn't, but we're glad to give them to anyone. We can leave copies here if you'd like them.
Great.
Yeah, sure.
Now, I just want to say, in regards to what Peter was saying, just to reiterate, if there is a subcommittee that's set up to look at the corrective action procedures and how those should go, to just ask once again that lab directors and quality assurance managers be included on that committee. That's all.
It has to be. Well, again, it's open to volunteers, anyone with an interest.
Yeah.
And I hope that the office, some near future date, identifies a technical director of the office who could actually lead that agenda.
And I know I don't mean to harp on this either, but if, I think the labs would love to participate if there was any way that DCJS could facilitate, travel expenses or things like that, because it is hard for the laboratories to send people to Albany or wherever, or even if we can do it, through phone, video. We have video conference set up at our laboratory. We're happy to host the closer laboratories.
Thank you. Anything else?
Just for my own clarification, because I want to make sure I give this commission and DCGS what they're asking for regarding this 6-month full review. Will we be contacted by either the commission or DCGS to have us or give us an idea of what exactly you want looked at? And we will also make the same type of effort to, because other than going through corrective actions, internal audits, and ASCLD audits, I'm not sure I'm really familiar with the general term of a full management review. So I just want to make sure that we do what you're asking.
I think that's a fair request.
So do you have specific items that you would like to
that
you could provide to us?
I think I could.
If anyone else has.
I think I would like to sit down with some of my colleagues, think about that, and reduce it to writing, send it to the chair of the commission, for the chair of the commission to review, and then send it on to Monroe County. But while we're doing that, you should go full speed ahead with your review. Don't wait for our letter.
Okay?
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to throw an additional practice into the mix. This commission has for many, many years discussed blind proficiency testing. By definition, proficiency testing that's done or managed externally to the laboratory. I think through the years we've been looking to the laboratory to do it internally, design and implementation and review. Barry Scheck, as usual, he's very insightful in that a blind PT, of course, you want validated materials to go through the laboratory so that there can be an independent assessment of the accuracy of that laboratory. NICLAC has reviewed the logistics of blind proficiency testing and has justly concluded that it's a challenge for the laboratory to manage. And again, I would argue that it's not appropriate for the laboratory to manage. I think Mr. Bowman, is it? Yes. Individuals in your position where in fact you provide oversight of lab clients, that perhaps if this office or commission, an approved PT provider, were to give to you validated materials for submission to someone in your organization to develop a package as a mock case and to submit it to the laboratory as such, blind to the laboratory, that may be a practical way to design a blind proficiency testing. So I'm just asking, in the mix of all that we're asking, management reviews and proposals, that consideration be given to blind proficiency testing and whether in fact in the Monroe organization that it might be feasible to introduce characterized materials into the laboratory as blind PT specimens.
And as a friendly amendment to that, the areas where I think it would be easiest, having been through efforts to do this, it would be very good to do it in tool marks on bullets, if you do that in your lab, and fingerprints.
And I would add to
Yeah, and controlled substances.
May I speak a little bit? I guess I'm a little confused. You're asking Monroe County to determine how to develop blind proficiency
Whether in
tests?
fact in an organization, and their organization is similar to other county jurisdictions, whether in fact in their evaluation is practical.
Okay, so I think the issue that you have though is you're asking Mr. Bowman, is it practical for his police department to participate in that? But you also need to be asking the question, who is going to create the samples? How are they going to be documented?
PT providers.
So you're going to get them from an external PT provider?
Excess material that wasn't used in the open PT, be used, submitted as blind.
So should we also then be asking the external PT provider if they to be able to use this as well as?
Well, in fact, all I'm asking is that if materials were provided, could they? If they say, yes, we could, then we address the question of, well, who's going to supply the material?
And I think too, perhaps you should read there, I can send you, there is a document that NIJ put together about blind proficiency testing and some of the issues that the police agencies expressed concern when they were doing that. So if you're going to research this, you may want to look into that.
Yeah, I was on that committee.
Hi, buddy.
That was already 11 years ago. And we were tasked to look at, DNA, right? And so we did succeed in doing some blind proficiency tests. And Paul Scheckman, when he was here, actually did a blind proficiency test on a rape case. So it's a little harder when you're taking, genes that have, blood spatter on it, and you want to create that. I'll concede that that's a little harder challenge. But the one thing that is Richard is pointing out, if it's just tox, right, samples, if it's just fingerprints, if it's just bullets, right, and you have a validated PT provider, I don't think it's. I think it's a little easier to send that to a lab and make them think it's a real case.
With the exception, I think, like say you're talking fingerprints, you don't have a PT provider currently that sends, a screwdriver for someone to develop fingerprints. That does not exist. What you have for fingerprints is known fingerprints that are placed on a card and they're being asked to compare. So, a lab's going to see, when you get a card that's not a lift or something like that, they're going to know. So I do think it's not as simple as just going to an external PT provider and saying, can I have your samples? Because they actually, in a fingerprint situation, they're going to look like a PT. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying I think this all should be discussed at some point.
But to be blunt about this, right, I absolutely refuse to believe. We have people here from internal affairs of some of the major police departments who do integrity tests all the time. This ain't that hard. It just isn't hard.
Well, that might be true, so maybe this is how you do it. You look and see if it can be done or not.
I mean, it really is.
Anything else? To the next item. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We just note for the record that the chair is being relinquished, Ms. Bianchi, and going back to Chairman Keene.
We'll absolutely note that. I believe the next item on our agenda relates to lab disclosures. The first one relates to the Suffolk County Crime Lab.
This is an update we've been notified of this previously regarding contamination on a PT test. And we do have Dan Chesworth here as well. Anybody else from Suffolk County?
Just myself.
And he's a hearing manager, and he can speak to this issue. You have been notified of this before. You were first notified in November of 2011. And also the DNA subcommittee has been notified and has received updates. the latest being at the March and May 2012 meeting.
Is there anything you want to add regarding, did the DNA subcommittee make any finding or take any action on this?
No, they didn't.
Anyone have any questions for Suffolk or any discussion on this item? All right, thank you. And I believe our next disclosure relates to the New York City Office of the Chief Medical Examiner.
This is an update on a corrective action as well regarding the reporting of false negatives. Commission has received notification first in October of 2011 and also updates in December of 2011, as well as the DNA subcommittee. Eugene Leon is here, quality manager, to address any further questions. I think they are still in progress on this corrective action. As well as Dr. Prince, lab director.
Any questions for the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner on this issue or any discussion on this issue?
Is it still open? It's still.
Yes, we do have an update that we'd like
Yes,
to
even
present.
if there are no questions, we would like to give an update.
Thanks.
So in addition to the letters provided, we want to just make sure that we update everybody on the reanalysis project that we've initiated due to a former technician reporting false negative serology results. As Kathy has mentioned, this has been reported to the Commission on 3 previous occasions, and we've tried to keep everybody updated, including the DNA subcommittee and our DA's offices. As our letter indicates, over 100 cases were re-examined during the reanalysis phase of our corrective action. And by re-examine or reanalyze, I mean that the evidence item in question was looked at and tested for serological stains by another criminalist, and all the results were technically reviewed. While doing this, we did discover that several cases did have discrepancy concerning the contents of the kit, meaning either an item was missing from the kit or an item was from another case was found within that kit. So therefore, we initiated phase 2 of this corrective action. And we committed to re-inventorying the remainder of the cases that were on this corrective action list. And when I say re-inventory, I mean that each kit was opened and checked for its content in comparison to the original evidence received section of our forensic biology report. And of course, all the results were documented on the form. Out of the 431 cases that we've either reanalyzed or re-inventoried, we have found that there were 16 misplaced items that affected 19 cases in total. In the process of returning items to its proper kits, meaning we found an item that was found in an incorrect kit, we want to return that to the proper kit. We discovered that some of these kits were not on the original case, original list of cases that was identified for this corrective action. So, for example, an item belonging to case B was found in A, but then when we went to return this item to case B, we found that case B isn't on the original list, and we realized that there's a discrepancy regarding the total number of lists, the cases that we have. And we therefore revisited our original query, and we identified an additional 430 cases that were not on the original list. We discovered this last Monday on June 4th, 2012. We did identify the root cause of this discrepancy in terms of the list. Phase 1, which concerns the reanalysis of the 116 sexual assault kits, those concentrated on negative serology cases that the former technician reported. However, in phase 2, what we neglected to do was we neglected to take into consideration the positive cases that this former employee had examined. So the OCME Department of Forensic Biology will now pursue a phase 3 of this corrective action to re-inventory all of the 430 identified cases. Some of these cases also had some negative items of the of evidence that will be reanalyzed. We're not concerned about the accuracy of positive findings because subsequent confirmation and testing was always done by another criminalist. So all the results there were confirmed.
taking into consideration of current staffing levels and current caseload.
I'm sorry, just a quick question.
Sure thing.
You said they were confirmed. You mean, were they confirmed because a DNA profile was obtained for, a male DNA profile was obtained?
Either a male DNA profile was obtained or during the quantitation phase, we had found that there was indeed some DNA in there to be able to sample for the testing.
The mistake this technician had made was in a presumptive semen test, the AP test. Anything that she had decided was positive is then going to a confirmatory P30 ELISA test. So we are not concerned about the positive
results. Taking into consideration of current staffing levels and the current daily caseload that we have, we estimate that to inventory the 430 cases, the completion of phase 3 would take approximately 4 to 5 months. The entire corrective action is a priority for the OCME Department of Forensic Biology, and we'll make every effort to complete this in as thorough and as expeditious a manner as possible. I do want to thank Chief Pulaski and the NYPD for their very kind assistance in this matter. Throughout this corrective action, the NYPD was able to help us expeditiously in retrieving these kits, and we do thank you, thank the NYPD for their hard work and their help with this.
I just had a few questions. How does this migration of parts of one kit to another happen? How does that mechanically happen? Have you figured that out?
We have a rotation system, if that's what you're asking, where we have examiners that would examine an item of evidence and then submit the items of a cutting of the items of evidence to a further confirmatory step. For example, in this case, if there were underwear that was included within a sexual assault kit, the initial examiner would examine and do a presumptive testing to see whether or not semen or blood was present. And that cutting, if it was appropriate, would be sent on to a confirmation testing. For example, semen, we have P30 ELISA, and that would confirm the testing. That's done by a separate analyst in the center.
So how does it migrate?
I can answer that question.
Yeah.
So in blatant disregard to our standard operating procedure, this analyst had several rape kits from different cases open at the same time.
On the bench.
So she was supposed to, after, like Eugene explained, after serology findings are received, if everything is negative, she is supposed to reseal all the envelopes, close the kit, reseal it, and return it to our evidence unit for return to the property clerk, from NYPD property clerk. She is only supposed to have one kit open at a time. She must have had multiple kits open at a time. We actually were able to see dates where we saw how the transfer happened.
As part of your review, do you have to inquire whether or not other analysts were making the same mistake?
We have changed our procedure somewhat, where we now allow actually other people to close kits. So honestly, let me rephrase. We now have the blind reanalysis program. So we do actually target 48 kits every year that get pulled back and get retested completely.
Randomly.
Yes, right. It is a random process, and they get A, re-inventoried, and B, every item gets retested. So that's the blind reanalysis program. We also have supervisors in the exam room that are basically present when analysts are doing this type of work. The specific analyst, she was simply overwhelmed. She had a tendency to stay late. I feel that some of the problems were caused by the fact that she was staying late and no supervisors were present in the lab anymore. So we have not checked other analysts' kits for re-inventory problems.
And why wouldn't you do that as part of an auditing function? Okay, I'm not talking about something as exhaustive as this, but why would you not do some kind of inquiry, which may include a random selection of their cases, to see whether or not this problem was limited to one analyst, or whether because of other factors, when you're doing a root cause analysis, it may have migrated to other analysts.
Yeah, you mean like prior to 2010 when
Yeah,
we
yeah,
started
yeah.
the blind
Exactly.
analysis. Right,
Right.
we would have to work
Yeah.
that out.
Closing process?
No, they could still have several open when they close at the same time. Yeah. I mean, this change in process where now a separate technician can actually take over the task of returning a kit to
Where it should
from in
So
progress
it's
to.
not on the bench. So it's
Yeah.
not on the bench when the other kid is over.
Right, I mean, that's.
Yeah,
There
all I'm
is always
suggesting
a
is
component.
you've clearly implemented new controls to deal with the root cause. All I'm asking is that at the time prior to that, it may not have been limited to this one analyst, and then there needs to be a mechanism that you can somehow check
Yeah, we
that
should-
hypothesis, that's all.
We would have to try
We'll
get
try
some
to-
sampling of cases back to see
Yeah.
what's going on.
Could be a system error. not
So
a-
also, can you tell us, because it's apropos of the question we put to Monroe,
Okay.
what is your protocol now for looking at, let's say, an item of underpants or something, for the presence of semen or sperm?
The protocol is that you're supposed to use Illumilite in a dark room. But it does not specifically say you have to spend 10 minutes on an item. It's basically a general protocol.
We do have microscopy in place, just much like what I've read. We do, when an analyst checks that slide, if they do I'm sorry.
Was the question about slides or?
No,
about
but the
underwear?
question
What
is,
is
the
the
question is
procedure
not
for
what,
identifying?
yours was not the question. The question is, so for instance, it used to be that you would first do some kind of presumptive test, whether it's P30 or acid phosphatase, and then depending on whether it's positive or negative, you then do microscopy.
Correct.
What is your protocol with respect to those things?
Much like that, we do a presumptive test. We use alpha phosphatase testing, and we test to see whether or not semen is presumptively present. If it is present, we'll send it. Our procedure actually for sexual assault kits, we automatically examine the slide that is there for the presence of sperm. If it is not there, then we take a cutting of that swab and we send it on for P30 ELISA confirmation. So in terms of confirming whether or not semen is present, we have two steps in there, which is the microscopy. And if that's positive, we stop. We do send the swab directly to DNA analysis. However, if it is negative, we then cut the swab for additional confirmation, because we take the confirmation of semen to be either sperm is present or P30 protein is present.
So just to elucidate us, okay, when you do microscopy and you do examine the slide, do you have a protocol for how the analyst is to survey a slide for the presence or absence of spermatozoa?
That is taught during training. We do, like I said, we have, hopefully this will answer your question, we have the confirmation step there. So if your concern is that the analyst may not find spermatozoa on that slide, if he or she does not find it, that swab is automatically cut for P30 ELISA analysis.
No, but it's conceivable that you can have a negative, you could have a positive acid phosphatase, you could have a negative P30, and you could miss seeing sperm that are actually there. So that's why I'm wondering, what is the procedure at the OCME now for analysts who are analyzing a slide? Is the entire slide surveyed?
Absolutely. The entire slide is surveyed. We don't pick one portion of the slide or the middle of the slide. That entire slide is surveyed to see whether or not spermatozoa is present, and we'll make our conclusions then.
Do you have any knowledge whether that is standard in the other DNA labs in the state, that they survey the whole slide?
Unfortunately, I don't know.
That's a fairly time-consuming
Yes, I mean, that is a
endeavor.
decision you have to make, how much time are you going to spend.
And that, just for the benefit of everybody, that's an extremely important step, because you will find that depending on how the swab is put down, that you may get, some parts of it may get the spermatozoa, some parts may not. And the best confirmation is actually looking under the microscope and seeing whether there are sperm heads. And those other tests can be misleading. So the thoroughness of that particular test is important.
It goes both ways. You
Yeah.
can have a sampling error on the slide and a sampling
Yes,
error.
but look, actually looking under the microscope to see if you see sperm is the key.
Is there any other questions related to the disclosure?
Disagree. Yeah. Were you able to determine if there was a finite period when this particular analyst was overwhelmed? Because I see it's a 10-year period that you went back. But when you found the 330 cases, was it in the end of the 10-year period, the middle, the beginning?
I
Was
believe
all over?
it was all scattered, sir.
Scattered?
Yes.
And just so I'm clear, part of what she was able to do was work late at night when supervisors weren't around.
Yes.
Have you stopped that? Or I think on one hand, we want them to work. We don't want them to work so hard that they make mistakes. Is that the issue, that there was no supervisors around? Do you still allow people to work late?
We do still allow people to work late. We have core work hours. We also have given additional training to our supervisors on how to handle performance review and performance monitoring. And I do believe that she was an extreme case. We have definitely changed. From a timeline point of view, she was removed from this duty in 2008. That was after we moved to our new DNA building and after we modified the kit closing procedure. Right now, things are really different. People are not staying as late. Supervisors have been retrained.
Just let me underscore for you something that I read about 2 years ago. The FBI's anthrax report, the final report that identified the scientist who they claim was responsible, one of the ways he was able to achieve the results that the FBI claims he achieved was by working nights and weekends when no one was around. And he had access to those specimens. So I assume that the FBI has taken some steps to change that procedure, probably cameras in the room. Yours is a little bit different. You've gone to a random sampling at the end of the year to try and catch them.
Every month.
And you also have these performance evaluations by the supervisor. In the performance evaluation, does the supervisor check to see if the person's working late, or they know that? You can tell that?
No, I mean, the time and the monitoring of time and that is independent. I mean, that's a standard supervisory task.
Thank you.
Anything else with regard to the disclosure? Thank you, appreciate it. And the next disclosure relates to Westchester County.
We have two lab disclosures from Westchester County. The first one is related to a fire debris issue. And I also inadvertently left out a February 2nd closeout letter from ASCI Lab. ASCI Lab has closed this. So I do have that. I failed to just send it off to you. But you'll see that they have numerous letters. They've notified the Legal Aid Society. They've notified the ASCI Lab. And we have representatives from Westchester County here, Bob, and Linda Duffy, and who else?
Ted Schwartz, he's sitting down.
Ted Schwartz. Who's the Trace supervisor.
Anything you want to add? Or any questions?
Questions?
All right, thank you.
Well, we have another one, the controlled substance issue as well. Go away.
Not so fast.
And that one was just as an initial notification to ASCI Lab on April 23rd of this year. And this was no report was issued in this. It is only brought up to be a level 1 nonconformance since it's a repeat occurrence by the same analyst. And it involves an extraction that was not done. I guess that the review of the past incident, which I think occurred in December 2010, and it was discovered then that the analyst had failed to do the required extraction in 3 cases.
That analyst has been taken off of casework?
Yes.
Anything you want to add on that? Any questions?
What percentage of your cases undergo technical review?
100%.
100%?
In imaging? Almost all of ours do. In imaging, I think we do 100.
Why was this missed in technical review? The fact that the extraction wasn't...
That's where it was caught. That's where it was caught.
Oh, it was? Oh,
yeah. These never went out as reports.
Reports did not go
okay.
out.
Very good.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Next disclosure relates to the New York Police Department Police Laboratory.
Yeah, there are two lab disclosures in this one, and it's more of an update. Oh no, these are two new ones. The first one is regarding the firearms incident at analyst is now retired. It was an old case that they were bringing back to look at, and it was an incorrect number of lands and grooves. And the second case, which it was about inaccurate evidence inventory about a criminal who's now retired. And our lab director, Scott O'Neill, is here, and the chief of detectives, Bill Pulaski.
Anything that you want to add? Anyone have any questions? All right, thank you.
No, thank you.
I believe that takes care of our lab disclosures. The next item relates to NICLAC, and I think the first issue was an update with regard to the laboratory reanalysis program. Is that correct?
Yes, we were asked at the last meeting to provide last meeting we gave an update on the 2 years that the labs had been doing the reanalysis. We were asked to put that on, to identify who the update came from, so I did that and sent that. And then also it was asked if there was the underlying data for the cases that were completed for reanalysis, and we provided a table for the analysis from 2010 and from 2011, which are the 2 years that it was in full form.
Anyone have any questions or any discussion on that item? Thank you for providing that. I guess the next issue relates to both NICLAC and the Inspector General, and I think is a continuation of our discussion from the last meeting, if I recall correctly, relating to the handling of complaints. I don't know if you want to add anything or summarize the issue that you had raised there.
Sure. Is the Inspector General still here?
I should be right back.
Okay. So at a previous commission meeting, it was brought up that there was no distinct procedure for how these complaints are handled. Some go to DCJS directly, some go to the labs directly, some go to the IG directly, and then someone has to make a decision, is it of the level that it should be referred to the IG? And these things are handled in different ways, and it was asked of NICLAC to give our recommendations as how we thought these complaints should be handled. So NICLAC met, and we came up with our recommendations, our suggestions, which you all have already seen. I don't know, should I go through those, or?
If you want to just summarize briefly.
I think, in summary, we were just thinking that the first issue was that while some, as I said, some go to DCJS and some go directly to the IG, that it seemed to us that DCJS maybe wasn't the right entity to determine what should go to the IG or not. And so we were suggesting that just all complaints would go to the IG, and the IG could determine if it was something that met their standard of something they would investigate. That was our first recommendation. Our second recommendation was relating to these specific complaints that come in anonymously, and in particular, in the last few years, there had been a number of these complaints that were very egregious, or they very kind of, when you read the letter, what the person was accusing a lab director of doing was quite severe and quite upsetting, I think. And I think the issue that the laboratory directors felt was that because these are anonymous complaints, basically anyone can write anything about anybody and send it out. What happens is when these go to DCJS, because DCJS has to refer this to the IG's office, they also alert the commission members and provide a copy of that letter to the commission members and say, we're going to send this to the IG's office. And as lab directors, we felt we didn't really understand the need for that because some of these are so slanderous or whatever that we felt it was sort of inappropriate for the members on the commission to be receiving these letters of these outrageous claims when in fact after the OIG investigated they determined that these were unfounded. So we felt that rather than have 14 people in the room be given this information, perhaps it would be better to send it to the IG first if it's determined unfounded. Then that information doesn't need to be shared with everybody. And there was a comment made at the last meeting that, well, none of this information has ever been leaked from the commission. And we never implied that or meant to imply that. We're not saying that anyone's leaking the information. We're just saying, and I'll take something that Mr. Scheck brings up all the time, Dr. Dror, once you have information in your head, you really can't get rid of it. It's stuck there. So whether it's conscious or unconscious, if someone writes a letter that says Kathy Corrado smokes crack in her office all day long, you know, I would like to think you would kind of know that's probably not true. But you know, in your head, Kathy Corrado smokes crack in her office. And, you know, depending on some of these allegations were very severe. And we just felt like, why should a person have to then, every time they see the commission, it's in someone's head. Was it true, was it not true? It was unfounded, but it's still in your head. It still leaves this impression. And so we felt, I guess we didn't see the benefit to having the commission have those letters. I mean, certainly if it's something that relates to the lab and how the lab's being handled and technical issues, that makes sense. But some of these were so personal, we just didn't see the benefit to everyone on the commission having that information before it went to the IG's office. So we recommended they just go directly to the IG's office to be investigated. And I guess the last thing that we said was, what we thought was that there was an instance a couple months ago where a letter was sent and there was a lot of investigation started by DCJS and by the IG's office on a case involving a laboratory, and that case was in the middle of trial or prior to trial. And there was, you know, the question was, well, should the investigation have been started if it's in the middle of litigation? And so our thought was, in a lot of these instances, when the IG might get the complaint or DCJS might get the complaint, the lab sometimes has already had that complaint 6 months prior and has already investigated, has already sent it to the proper channels and has looked up the case, especially if it's coming from an inmate that's talking about a case. Typically the lab would have done all that research. We felt like, let's save everybody some time. If the IG could alert the lab in those situations, the lab could say, oh yes, we've dealt with this, here's the investigation we've done, so you have something to start with. And as well, if there was pending litigation or something like that, people should be told of that. So we just felt like when it was appropriate that the allegations could be given to the lab director so they could at least start providing the information, or at least provide information that might help the investigation go a little quicker.
As I see it, there's three issues. And I think the first issue you've identified relates to what goes to the Inspector General. The Inspector General has written us a letter correctly pointing out that the jurisdiction is to look into or to investigate basically Coverdale defined issues. And I don't think that requires any vote of the Commission, because I can say when information or allegations come to DCJS or come to the Office of Forensic Services, if we believe rises to that level, we're going to forward them to the Inspector General, and we'll certainly err on the side of caution. You know, I mean, if it doesn't rise to that level, as they correctly point out, they won't go there. I don't think that requires any action of the Commission. The second issue, as I understand, relates to what type of information comes to this Commission when an anonymous allegation is received and forwarded to the Inspector General. And I think your example is a good one. Someone says a lab director is smoking crack in their office. We forward that to the Inspector General. My proposal would be that the Commission get notified that in fact there was a referral to the Inspector General and what lab that it was regarding. But I think your point is well taken. When it's an anonymous letter of that type, you know, until there's some finding that there's some substance to it, I don't see why the Commission needs to have the substance of those allegations prior to the Inspector General doing an investigation.
Don't we have independent oversight then? I mean, our oversight, Michael, is not coextensive with the IG. The IG's oversight derives from Coverdale. Our oversight derives from statute. And I don't understand why we wouldn't get that information, because there might be something to it that we on the commission feel might raise a relevant question. The only reason not to, I missed the beginning of the meeting, I'm sorry on this, I said that for a minute, this issue came up. The only reason that you would ever want to even change the status quo is if you felt that by notifying the commission, somehow there's a breach of confidentiality and there's a risk of things getting out, and at least to date, that's never happened.
I think it probably would be a good idea to separate this into two different categories of allegations. If there's an allegation relating to lab work, the director or someone in the lab is, dry labbing, or, is not following procedure, or is testing incorrectly, I absolutely agree with you. I guess what I'm struggling with is the example here where, there's an anonymous letter that comes in, says the lab director is smoking crack in her office. In that, let me finish. In that instance, are you, as I don't have the history in the commission, you do. Does the commission historically has independently looked into those issues?
No,
we haven't looked into them.
Then why do we need to know?
No, here's the kind of thing that arose, I think, that Kathy's referring to. And there were a series of anonymous complaints that were made. And the nature of these anonymous complaints were so-and-so is given bribes, gifts, etc., to some higher-up in a laboratory, and that is affecting the lab results. So it always arose in the context of an allegation that there was some kind of serious negligence or misconduct that affected the integrity of results. For all I know, there have been hundreds of, complaints made saying something, this lab director is, I don't know, cross-dressing or doing whatever, I don't care, that we've never seen. But every one that we saw arose in the context of a lab result. Now, I appreciate what Kathy is saying, that in this particular instance, we got them again and again and again and again, and they were personal, right? And I'll take the citation to Dr. Dror and the cognitive science problems that arose, but these are the kinds of things that people in public positions, wind up hearing all the time. And in the end, in this instance, for example, I think that exactly the opposite happened. That is to say that after a while, and when eventually it was determined that these things were, somebody had a personal axe to grind, but they always arose in the context of serious negligence and misconduct having to do with a particular result. And in fact, some of them were not trivial cases. I mean, some of them were cases you'd open up the newspaper and, this person was, these anonymous complaints were coming in on cases that were of, there was one instance that I remember, we got this in and we talked about it with Denise. We sent it right to the prosecutor that was dealing with the case that was on trial that moment. So that's how they arose.
Is there any? So what are you suggesting, though?
I'm suggesting that I'm suggesting that our procedures have been fine, and.
But don't you think? I'm sorry. I think it's a little bit different when a laboratory has to come here and sit in that chair and be questioned by people who may or may not in their head think, I wonder how true that was, or I wonder. I mean, it's what if people started writing letters about commission members, and should that be distributed to everybody as well?
My God, they've written so many of that stuff.
I'm just saying, and I'm not, maybe the discussion, then we'll vote and it'll be what it is. I understand. I think we just wanted to put it out there. And I can tell you as a lab director, it's a little disconcerting because these are people that I work with and I see, and, it's just, to see these things come through, I would prefer to not see it because they can say I'm smoking crack and that's why my cases are bad. And there you go, inspected.
No, but Kathleen, we can go into executive session, so it's not just having a lab director sit up there, and we make hopefully mature decisions about what goes further, what goes directly to the Inspector General, what warrants some other kind of response in addition to that. But people have been extremely discreet. You haven't had any kind of breaches in the past for years. If it's not broken, why change it?
In truth, Kathy, one of the things that's really, one of the criticisms that was made of our commission by the Inspector General with respect to Nassau County, that, frankly, some of us who've been here from the beginning had to take to heart. We have been so careful, right, in not taking anything that we heard here, right, even things that were said in public session, and taking that outside and giving it to newspapers or telling the defense bar or telling judges or in any way that, if anything, we could be faulted for that because, and we're faulted for not perhaps making it as well known as commission members as we should have to public officials and the defense bar in Nassau County that there were these repeated reports that there were deficiencies in the lab. So, if anything, I could just speak for myself, right? That because, frankly, some of us got over the years lots of anonymous things that we then passed on to the commissioners, that was then passed on to district attorneys, and we were the ones that wound up initiating these things in executive session because the anonymous things came to us. I mean, there really haven't been that many, and there certainly were none, Mike, that did not go directly to an allegation about some problem in the lab work, right? Because I don't think any of us really want to know anything that's a personnel complaint about any lab director that doesn't relate to the quality of the lab work. I certainly don't.
So, yeah, I think we've discussed the issue. We have a rule. If someone wants to make a motion, we can vote on the motion. If someone wants to make a motion to change it, if not, we'll move on to the third item.
Can I just ask a question of the Inspector General? Your letter, Catherine, the third paragraph, I was just a little confused. Is it your policy that if you get a letter that you look at it and say, okay, it meets the criteria, we'll move forward, and if it doesn't,
Well, they actually fall into three categories. One, if it appears by its face it doesn't meet the Coverdell jurisdiction, then we don't do anything with it. If there is a question, the second area being if there's a question of whether it meets Coverdell jurisdiction, we will do a preliminary investigation to see if we meet that threshold. And depending on that preliminary investigation, we'll decide how to proceed. And then obviously the third is if it clearly falls within the jurisdiction of the conduct of investigation.
So would something in the first category be like something salacious that has absolutely nothing to do with the quality of the lab work?
That's absolutely right. And clearly, I think some of the things that the commissioners are talking about is personnel matters that should be handled through a labor, human resources department, IAB, things of those nature.
Do we get that stuff now? If the Inspector General finds that it doesn't meet the Coverdell threshold and it's an anonymous complaint, do we get those now?
Do we get them back to us?
No, do we, the commission members, get those complaints? Do we see them?
If it went to the IG
went to them
first.
directly, then no, we wouldn't see it.
Okay, but if it came to us and we sent it to the Inspector
Then they would
General.
report back to us.
And also, if
And
it
we
came
would-
to,
we
if it
would
came
see
to
them.
us, we see what comes to us.
Yep.
You would see it initially when it first comes in, when we refer it out to the Inspector General, and that's the issue.
And that, to me, that's sort of a double standard too. I mean, if the IG is getting something, we're not getting that same information. You think it's important that we have it, but it's okay if it goes to the IG, we don't need to see it. But if it comes to us, then we should definitely see it.
It's not a double standard. In fact, there are important reasoned distinctions. The whole notion of whistleblowing and external auditing functions in our society are that at certain times it becomes appropriate for the IG to go ahead and do an investigation and not notify the lab director until they conduct their investigation if it comes to them, because it might undermine their own legitimacy.
I think you're jumping to the third issue. We're not there yet. The double standard here is that what's being pointed out is if the allegation regarding the lab director in the instance we're using comes to the Office of Forensic Services or DCJS, and we refer it to the Inspector General, it goes to the Commissioner. If it goes straight to the Inspector General, and the Inspector General, that first step, makes a determination it doesn't rise to the level of the Coverdell issue, and what I'm understanding is that it never goes anywhere, it never comes to the commission, is that right?
Anything that is communicated from the forensic science to the IG, regardless of what we do, we respond back.
But if it comes directly to you, the anonymous complaint comes to you from who knows where.
That's right.
We never get that.
That's correct.
That's not a double standard. There are different protocols and procedures which exist the way people learn things. There was a time when Barry and I received anonymous complaints from people working at crime laboratories in New York State. What should we have done? Should we have just simply given them to the IG and not give them to DCJS?
I guess what I'm wrestling with is why is it that we need the substance of the allegations that come to DCJS before they go to the Inspector General, but we don't need the substance of the ones that go directly to the Inspector General?
Only in the situations, obviously, that they're unfounded.
Yeah, no, that's what we're dealing with. That's
Yeah, is there some middle ground here where, to use the Inspector General's criteria there, that we don't see the number ones, but we do the twos and threes?
I think there's like a disconnect here. If somebody thought it important enough to communicate whatever it is they wanted to communicate to this commission, okay, then the commission should see it. If they didn't think that, and they wanted to communicate directly to the Inspector General, that's something different.
You're assuming altruistic motives on the part of the complainant.
I'm not assuming any motive. I'm simply
You just said if it's important enough to come to this commission, but the motivation is to embarrass and humiliate a rival or somebody that disciplined them in the laboratory, and then that person has to come and sit here, and we're looking, oh yeah, this is the guy that is conducting the bacchanalian feast at the crime laboratory. I mean, it's just human nature.
But I think that what we were up to was the question of if a anonymous complaint goes to the IG, and the IG decides that it is not something that goes to the it's not serious negligence or misconduct that would affect the integrity of a forensic result, and they decide not to pursue it, they think it's unfounded, right? The question is, do we want to see those?
Presently, as I understand it, if it went directly to the IG, we never see it.
Right.
If it comes to DCJS, we do.
Right, and so that's the issue we're discussing,
Do we
right?
want to leave it that way, or does someone want to make a motion to change it? I think we've discussed it. I think we all understand different sides of the issue. So if someone wants to make a motion.
I would make a motion that we not see it.
Okay. Well, I have another question. I just have a technical question.
I second that motion.
Well, no, but what are you saying that we not see? Something that goes to the IG directly?
Oh, no, I thought you were...
That's what his motion is.
That's dismissed as unfounded.
That's dismissed
No,
as
but
unfounded.
Gina, his motion is that if somebody writes directly to the IG and doesn't contact this commission at all,
That's
then
not
we
on
don't
the
need
table
to see
because we
it.
don't see those at all.
Right. I guess the issue is, I have no motion.
You have no
I have no motion. I'm not going to ask them. I'd have to make a motion to ask them to send.
I have a technical question of the IG, which is, do we have the authority to ask you to show us things that you decide you didn't have jurisdiction to consider?
No.
Okay.
And I appreciate the question.
Thank you.
Wouldn't stop us from making a motion.
My motion is this, I'll try to articulate it, that, and strictly talking about anonymous complaints, any anonymous complaint that comes to the commission, either the chairman, council, and is then forwarded to the Inspector General, that the Inspector General, on its face, finds to not meet the Coverdale threshold and is therefore, in her words, to be unsubstantiated or unfounded, that we not need to see those.
Is there a second for that motion?
I second that.
All right, any other discussion?
Yeah, I strongly oppose it because you're missing, Bill, the fundamental difference in our oversight responsibilities of this commission and the limited oversight responsibilities of the Inspector General. There may be other things in there which don't technically meet the Coverdale requirements but nevertheless are things as part of our oversight of crime laboratories in New York State that we should look into. The reason that they don't, if they get something sent directly to them and don't send it to us, has to do with the powers and jurisdiction of the Inspector General's office. It's not because they have made a subjective determination in a particular case that there's nothing in there that we should know about, okay? They have a limited function, but there may be other things in there that we do. How can you know without seeing it, just because it's anonymous? Even if it doesn't meet Coverdale, that doesn't raise some other kinds of institutional questions that we, as the only oversight body in New York for crime laboratories, wouldn't be interested in. If somebody thought enough of sending it to this commission, then the commission should see it. And there's no, and you cannot point to a single instance in all the years that we've been in existence where there's been a single breach of that trust.
I agree with that.
Okay? And in the absence of anything like that, what would be the strategic reason for changing the status quo?
Well, I think Kathy articulated that when you're out of the room, namely that when you're dealing with people on a professional basis and they have to come and sit here, it's very, very, I think, disconcerting to have someone talking about salacious, inappropriate material that has been found to be without merit while they're dealing with us on a face-to-face basis.
But there's nothing to prevent us from going to executive session and not even doing that if we feel it doesn't fall within any of our other criteria for why we would want to have inquiry into that. We make that kind of mature decision even before we would call someone in here, even if it's an executive session.
If someone writes something to this commission, and if it's in the category that I'll call salacious and irrelevant, and it's a personal ad hominem attack on somebody who's a lab director who may have disciplined this employee, who may be a hard disciplinarian or some other personal criteria, might be having an affair with somebody that this person has an interest in. I have no desire, interest whatsoever to learn any of that material or to discuss it or to have to sit next to someone and say, oh yeah, this is the guy that was alleged to have had the affair. If it has something to do with the operation of the laboratory and the person makes it known to this commission and then nothing happens, if the person's as dedicated as you're giving this person credit for, they're going to reach out to somebody else.
No, I'm not giving them credit. What I'm giving credit to is us. And I'm giving credit to us being able to make a mature decision and look at something, and if it looks as salacious and irrelevant as you describe it, we will treat it as such and it'll end up in a trash can, okay? And that'll be it. And I would assume that in your responsibility as a district attorney of Onondaga County that you get nonsensical letters from people from time to time, okay, that don't warrant further investigation, and you're able to use your own critical faculties to separate the wheat from the chaff. This commission does that routinely and should be expected to do that routinely.
I don't share them with my assistant DAs.
I understand that, but we're part of the
or
commission.
My chief assistant DA.
But we are the commission.
Okay, well, I mean,
I don't share them with other people in my office. I assume you don't either. You keep them within this commission. And that's what we're saying here.
We've designated the Inspector General as our agent for investigation. We don't do investigations. On every one of those letters that I've ever sent out, I've never gotten a response back that said, how are we investigating this? As a commission, as a body of individuals, nobody has ever said, well, what are we going to do about this?
Unfortunately, that's one of the fundamental criticisms, okay, historically, that the IG raised in the aftermath of Nassau County, that we have not, okay, functioned in a way. We've delegated everything to everybody. We delegate all accreditation to ASCOT Lab. We delegate any kind of other investigation to the IG. But we have statutory responsibilities. Gina, we have statutory responsibilities that go beyond Coverdale.
Well, that's true. But we have
and we have not.
responsibilities.
No, and we also we have general oversight over the crime laboratories, and we can choose to relinquish that, which we can choose to simply delegate that to somebody else, to you. I guess we could do that. But right now, there's no reason why we should not continue to do it the way we've been doing it if it hasn't been an embarrassing situation yet for someone to sit there.
So why should we get to that embarrassing situation and have that cognitive bias?
Because it may not be that. Who makes the subjective determination? You? That this is purely salacious and doesn't apply to anything else? It might. and there hasn't been a problem. I don't want you making that decision. I don't want Mike Green making that decision, because you could make a subjective decision that's erroneous.
Well, those determinations...
No, the IG is limited to Coverdale. The IG doesn't deal with other aspects of our oversight.
I think we all understand the issues.
Mike, I have just one question for you. If you get a letter tomorrow morning, it's an anonymous complaint, and it's from somebody at a lab who says, I'm X, I work at this lab, and I know that Y and Z are engaged in improper conduct and have been for a while, and as a result, Y is allowed to go home early, doesn't do the same work as the rest of us. Is that a salacious letter meriting no further action? Or is that, of course, to be sent to the IG? Or do you make a decision at that point and err on the side of caution, and because that could impact the work in the lab, in some shape, manner, or form, that it would then be distributed to the commission and then sent to the IG?
Can I just clarify for 1 second? You said it was anonymous at first, but then you said I'm X.
No, it's an anonymous report, and the person says, I'm aware that in this laboratory, in the lab, X and Y are having an improper sexual relationship. And as a result, X is a supervisor, Y is permitted to not do work, go home early, and got a pay raise. And would that be a kind of letter that you would now take and just bypass the commission and send right to the IG? Or do you sit at your desk and say, this kind of thing is very salacious, it's really disgusting, but the letter impacts on the work in the lab. And I think the fellow commissioners have to see it.
Right now, it's my understanding that everything that we refer to the IG also goes to this commission. So if I look at it, and I think there's any argument that there's an allegation of a Coverdale violation, then it goes to the Inspector General, and a copy of it goes to the commission.
Now, and I would just, this whole discussion is making me a little uncomfortable because we are not discussing it in executive session, okay? And what I'm saying to you is that in my experience, right, in this commission from the beginning, there has never been one of these letters that did not relate to lab work. And
we don't discuss things in executive session unless they fall within the open meetings law that are eligible to be discussed in executive session. So we discuss everything that's not within one of those categories in open meeting.
Huh? I don't get that. Right? We've had plenty of discussions in an executive session of matters like this.
With regard to matters that would affect discipline of a particular employee, but not that would be a general discussion.
We've had a number of discussions of things that were complaints, not...
I think the point is, I don't think we can discuss amending our rules in executive session. We can discuss...
Oh, you mean we can't have this discussion in executive
Correct.
session? All right, well, that's a problem because I'm telling you, what you're really asking, Mike, and it's a good question, and I think I can provide you some very important illustrative answers, goes along with what Bill was saying. I can think of an excellent example of something that turned out to be unfounded, right, but absolutely should have been discussed among all of us. We all agreed it had to be discussed, and we made referrals based on that were extremely important to an ongoing case. So I think, which goes towards answering, I think, your concern as an example of why some of this is useful to know, even if in the end it turns out to be unfounded, because it arguably was important for the integrity of a lab result or for the fairness of an ongoing prosecution.
No, I understand the point. All right, we have a motion, we have a second. All in favor? How many is that? 5 in favor. All opposed? 5 and 5, right?
I need second for that.
Right.
I've learned that one.
All right, the third part of this issue relates to where there's an allegation, a it goes to the Inspector General, and the issue is, should those allegations, it relates to a particular laboratory, should the lab director be put on notice of those allegations at the time it goes to the Inspector General or shortly thereafter? And if I understand the Inspector General's position is that they're opposed to it, in essence, because there's the potential that it could compromise the investigation. Is that correct?
That's right.
I guess personally, what I see here, I see some competing concerns, because on the one hand, we could create a situation by not notifying the lab director where there's a serious problem in the lab, and we don't tell the lab director, and that problem continues, and maybe you've got testimony, you could have someone going through a trial that they shouldn't be going through. So I understand the Inspector General's concern, and I also understand why lab directors would want to know, and why we might want lab directors to know right away. So
can I just expound a bit, because I really want to impress upon the point that and I can appreciate the concerns that I've raised. However, we are really vehemently opposed to releasing that type of information to lab directors and other superiors. I mean, you have charged us to be the independent investigatory agency for this commission. We need to act independently. We cannot be telling anybody about our investigations, and by charging us with this responsibility, you have to trust the fact that we know how to conduct investigations. I'm also asking you that if we see, and it's not just limited to matters from the Forensic Commission, it's also in the other duties and responsibilities of our office. If we find a situation that requires us to bring it to a lab director's attention, you have to believe in us and trust in us that we will do that, because it affects the integrity of something else that is going on. And certainly we do that. And we do that, as a matter of course, in the other matters that are in the Inspector General's office.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we would have the authority under law as a public commission to tell a law enforcement agency, you've got a complaint, we'd like you not to notify or to notify the lab director.
I don't think that's not at all what we've already made a decision that in addition to doing our covered L referral, we're going to notify the commission. Right. So now the issue is the motion is not to tell the Inspector General to do anything. And it's not even a motion. The issue on the table is, besides from the Inspector General and what they're doing, do we as a commission take any action to notify a lab director?
Here's the question that when I first read the recommendation that troubled me. If this were to become known that the commission is notifying lab directors and you get this kind of complaint, wouldn't that have a chilling effect on individuals in the lab technician community who have a legitimate complaint and want to come to this commission? Wouldn't they fear that no matter how much they disguise the complaint, that if the lab director got the information, and that's the public way of the commission does its business, that they might be found out?
Mike, why don't you capable of answering that as anybody else?
It seemed to me that has a really chilling effect.
I would invite the chair to simply ask if anybody has a motion.
Does anyone have a motion in this regard? All right.
Takes care of that.
I believe we have, the next item is the Inspector General's report with regard to Nassau County. It's now 20 minutes to 1, so we're 10 minutes late already. It's been on the agenda a number of times, and we never had the time. My suggestion would be that we schedule and hold a separate meeting with nothing on the agenda but the Inspector General's report with regard to Nassau County. At that meeting, we go through the recommendations one at a time and decide as a commission how we're going to do it.
I'll second that motion.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
The last thing
You can tell us.
We love seeing you. We love seeing you.
Are you going to schedule that as a separate meeting over and above the regular cycle?
Yes. Okay. Do we have a motion to go into executive discussion?
So moved.
Executive session. All right. Second. Okay. We're back in regular session. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
Yes.
Seconded? All in favor?
All right.
Anyone opposed? All right, thank you. We
Thanks,
will
Mike.
notify everyone the date of the special meeting.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.